in the Senate of the United States, sitting as a court of impeachment, NRE, impeachment of President Donald J. Trump, trial memorandum of the United States House of Representatives in the impeachment trial of President Donald J. Trump. United States House of Representatives, Adam B. Schiff, Jerrold Nadler, Zoe Lofgren, Hakeem S. Jeffries, Val Butler Demings, Jason Crow, Sylvia R. Garcia. U.S. House of Representatives, Managers. Table of Contents. Introduction. 1. Background. 9. 1. Constitutional grounds for presidential impeachment. 2. The House impeachment of President Donald J. Trump and presentation of this matter to the Senate. Argument. The Senate could convict President Trump of abuse of power. President Trump exercised his official power to pressure Ukraine into aiding his reelection. President Trump exercised official power to benefit himself personally. President Trump jeopardized U.S. national interests. 2. The Senate should convict President Trump of obstruction of Congress. The House is constitutionally entitled to the relevant information in an impeachment inquiry. President Trump's obstruction of the impeachment inquiry violates fundamental constitutional principles. President Trump's excuses for his obstructions are meritless. 3. The Senate should immediately remove President Trump from office to prevent further abuses. President Trump's repeated abuse of power presents an ongoing threat to our elections. President Trump's obstruction of Congress threatens our constitutional order. The Senate should convict and remove President Trump to protect our system of government and national security interests. Attached statement of material facts. Introduction. President Donald J. Trump used his official powers to pressure a foreign government to interfere in a United States election for his personal political gain, and then attempted to cover up his scheme by obstructing Congress's investigation into his misconduct. The Constitution provides a remedy when the president commits such serious abuses of his office: impeachment and removal. The Senate must use that remedy now to safeguard the 2020 U.S. election, protect our constitutional form of government, and eliminate the threat that the president poses to America's national security. The House adopted 2 articles of impeachment against President Trump. The first for abuse of power, the second for obstruction of Congress. The evidence overwhelmingly establishes that he is guilty of both. The only remaining question is whether the members of the Senate will accept and carry out the responsibility placed on them by the framers of our Constitution and their constitutional oaths. Abuse of power. President Trump abused the power of his office by pressuring the government of Ukraine to interfere in the 2020 U.S. presidential election for his own benefit. In order to pressure the recently elected Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to announce investigations that would advance President Trump's political interest and his 2020 re-election bid. The president exercised his official power to withhold from Ukraine critical U.S. government support, $391 million of vital military aid, and a coveted White House meeting. During a July 25, 2019 phone call after President Zelensky expressed gratitude to President Trump for American military assistance, President Trump immediately responded by asking President Zelensky to do us a favor, though. The favor he sought was for Ukraine to publicly announce 2 investigations that President Trump believed would improve his domestic political prospects. One investigation concerned former Vice President Joseph Biden Jr., a political rival in the upcoming 2020 election, and the false claim that, in seeking the removal of a corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor 4 years earlier, then Vice President Biden had acted to protect a company where his son was a board member. The second investigation concerned a debunked conspiracy theory that Russia did not interfere in the 2016 presidential election to aid President Trump, but instead that Ukraine interfered in that election to aid President Trump's opponent, Hillary Clinton. These theories were baseless. There is no credible evidence to support the allegation that former Vice President acted improperly in encouraging Ukraine to remove an incompetent and corrupt prosecutor in 2016. And the U.S. intelligence community, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and Special Counsel Robert S. Mueller III unanimously determined that Russia, not Ukraine, interfered in the 2016 U.S. presidential election in a sweeping and systematic fashion to help President Trump's campaign. In fact, the theory that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 election has been advanced by Russia's intelligence services as part of Russia's propaganda campaign. Although these theories were groundless, President Trump sought a public announcement by Ukraine of investigations into them in order to help his 2020 re-election campaign. An announcement of a Ukrainian investigation into one of his key political rivals would be enormously valuable to President Trump in his efforts to win re-election in 2020. Just as the FBI's investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails had helped him in 2016, and an investigation suggesting that President Trump did not benefit from Russian interference in the 2016 election would give him a basis to assert falsely that he was the victim rather than the beneficiary of foreign meddling in the last election. Ukraine's announcement of that investigation would bolster the perceived legitimacy of his presidency and therefore his political standing going into the 2020 race. Overwhelming evidence shows that President Trump solicited these two investigations in order to obtain a personal political benefit, not because the investigations served the national interest. The president's own national security advisor characterized the efforts to pressure Ukraine to announce investigations in exchange for official acts as a drug deal. His acting chief of staff candidly confessed that President Trump's decision to withhold security assistance was tied to his desire for an investigation into alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2020 election, stated that there is going to be political influence in foreign policy, and told the American people to get over it. Another one of President Trump's key national security advisors testified that the agents pursuing the president's bidding were involved in a domestic political errand, not national security policy. And immediately after speaking to President Trump by phone about the investigations, one of President Trump's ambassadors involved in carrying out the president's agenda in Ukraine said that President Trump did not give expletive about Ukraine and instead only cared about big stuff that benefited him personally, like the Biden investigation. To execute his scheme, President Trump assigned his personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, the task of securing the Ukraine investigations. Mr. Giuliani repeatedly and publicly emphasized that he was not engaged in foreign policy, but was instead seeking a personal benefit for his client, Donald Trump. President Trump used the vast powers of his office as president to pressure Ukraine into announcing these investigations. President Trump illegally withheld $391 million in taxpayer-funded military assistance to Ukraine that Congress had appropriated for expenditure in fiscal year 2019. That assistance was a critical part of long-running bipartisan efforts to advance the security interests of the United States by ensuring that Ukraine is properly equipped to defend itself against Russian aggression. Every relevant executive branch agency agreed that continued American support for Ukraine was in America's national security interest. But President Trump ignored that view and personally ordered the assistance held back, even after serious concerns. Now, confirmed by the Government Accountability Office, GAO, were raised within his administration about the legality of withholding funding that Congress had already appropriated. President Trump released the funding only after he got caught trying to use the security assistance as leverage to obtain foreign interference in his re-election campaign. When news of his scheme to withhold the funding broke, and shortly after the investigative committees in the House opened an investigation, President Trump relented and released the aid. As part of the same pressure campaign, President Trump withheld a crucial White House meeting with President Zelensky, a meeting that he had previously promised and that was a shared goal of both the United States and Ukraine. Such face-to-face Oval Office meetings with a U.S. president are immensely important for international credibility. In this case, an Oval Office meeting with President Trump was critical to the newly elected Ukrainian president because it would signal to Russia, which had invaded Ukraine in 2014 and still occupied Ukrainian territory, that Ukraine could count on American support. That meeting still has not occurred. Even though President Trump has met with over a dozen world leaders at the White House since President Zelensky's election, including an Oval Office meeting with Russia's top diplomat. President Trump's solicitation of foreign interference in our elections to secure his own political success is precisely why the framers of our Constitution provided Congress with the power to impeach a corrupt president and remove him from office. One of the founding generation's principal fears was that foreign governments would seek to manipulate American elections, the defining feature of our self-government. Thomas Jefferson and John Adams warned of foreign interference, intrigue, and influence, and predicted that as often as elections happen, the danger of foreign influence recurs. The framers, therefore, would have considered a president's attempt to corrupt America's democratic processes by demanding political favors from foreign powers to be a singularly pernicious act. They designed impeachment as the remedy for such misconduct because a president who manipulates U.S. elections to his advantage can avoid being held accountable by the voters through those same elections. And they would have viewed a president's efforts to encourage foreign election interference as all the more dangerous where, as here, those efforts are part of an ongoing pattern of misconduct for which the president is unrepentant. The House of Representatives gathered overwhelming evidence of President Trump's misconduct, which is summarized in the attached Statement of Material Facts and in the comprehensive reports prepared by the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and the Committee on the Judiciary. On the strength of that evidence, the House approved the first articles of impeachment against President Trump for abuse of power. The Senate should now convict him on that article. President Trump's continuing presence in office undermines the integrity of our democratic processes and endangers our national security. Obstruction of Congress. President Trump obstructed Congress by undertaking an unprecedented campaign to prevent House committees from investigating his misconduct. The Constitution entrusts the House with the sole power of impeachment. The framers thus ensured what common sense requires, that the House, not the President, determines the existence, scope, and procedures of an impeachment investigation into the President's conduct. The House cannot conduct such an investigation effectively if it cannot obtain information from the President or executive branch about the President's misconduct it is investigating. Under our constitutional system of divided powers, A president cannot be permitted to hide his offenses from view by refusing to comply with a congressional impeachment inquiry and ordering executive branch agencies to do the same. That conclusion is particularly important given the Department of Justice position that the president cannot be indicted. If the president could both avoid accountability under the criminal laws and preclude an effective impeachment investigation, he would truly be above the law. But that is what President Trump has attempted to do, and why President Trump's conduct is the framers' worst nightmare. He directed his administration to defy every subpoena issued in the House impeachment investigation. At his direction, the White House, Department of State, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and Office of Management and Budget, OMB, refused to produce a single document in response to those subpoenas. Several witnesses also followed President Trump's orders, defying requests for voluntary appearances and lawful subpoenas and refusing to testify. And President Trump's interference in the House impeachment inquiry was not an isolated incident. It was consistent with his past efforts to obstruct the special counsel's investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election. By categorically obstructing the House's impeachment inquiry, President Trump claimed the House's sole impeachment power for himself and sought to shield his misconduct from Congress and the American people. Although his sweeping cover-up effort ultimately failed, 17 public officials courageously upheld their duty, testified, and provided documentary evidence of the president's wrongdoing. His obstruction will do long-lasting and potentially irreparable damage to our constitutional system of divided powers if it goes unchecked. Based on the overwhelming evidence of the president's misconduct in attempting to thwart the impeachment inquiry, the House approved the second article of impeachment for obstruction of Congress. The Senate should now convict President Trump on that article. If it does not, future presidents will feel empowered to resist any investigation into their own wrongdoing, effectively nullifying Congress's power to exercise the Constitution's most important safeguard against presidential misconduct. That outcome would not only embolden this president to continue seeking foreign interference in our elections, but would telegraph to future presidents that they are free to engage in serious misconduct without accountability or repercussions. The Constitution entrusts Congress with the solemn task of impeaching and removing from office a president who engages in treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. The impeachment power is an essential check on the authority of the president, and Congress must exercise this power when the president places his personal and political interest above those of the nation. President Trump has done exactly that. His misconduct challenges the fundamental principle that Americans should decide American elections, and that a divided system of government in which no single branch operates without the check and balances of the others preserves the liberty we all hold dear. The country is watching to see how the Senate responds. History will judge each senator's willingness to rise above partisan differences, view the facts honestly, and defend the Constitution. The outcome of these proceedings will determine whether generations to come will enjoy a safe and secure democracy in which the president is not a king and in which no one, particularly the president, is above the law. Background. 1. Constitutional grounds for presidential impeachment. To understand why President Trump must be removed from office now, it is necessary to understand why the framers of our Constitution included the impeachment power as an essential part of the republic they created. The Constitution entrusts Congress with the exclusive power to impeach the president and convict and remove him from office. Article 1 vests the House with the sole power of impeachment, and the Senate with the sole power to try all impeachments and to convict upon a vote of 2/3 of its members. The Constitution specifies that the president shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. The Constitution further provides that the Senate may vote to permanently disqualify an impeached president from government service. The president takes an oath to faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States. Impeachment imposes a check on a president who violates that oath by using the powers of the office to advance his own interests at the expense of the national interest. Fresh from their experience under British rule by a king, the framers were concerned that corruption posed a grave threat to their new republic. As George Mason warned the other delegates to the Constitutional Convention, if we do not provide against corruption, our government will soon be at an end. The framers stressed that a president who acts from some corrupt motive or other, willfully abuses his trust, must be impeached, because the president will have great opportunities of abusing his power. The framers recognized that a president who abuses his power to manipulate the democratic processes cannot properly be held accountable by means of the very elections that he has rigged to his advantage. The framers specifically feared a president who abused his office by sparing no effort or means whatever to get himself reelected. Mason asked, "Shall the man who has practiced corruption and by that means procured his appointment in the first instance, be suffered to escape punishment by repeating his guilt?" Thus, the framers resolved to hold the president impeachable whilst in office as an essential security for the good behavior of the executive. By empowering Congress to immediately remove a president when his misconduct warrants it, the framers established the people's elected representatives as the ultimate check on a president whose corruption threatened our democracy and the nation's core interests. The framers particularly feared that foreign influence could undermine our new system of self-government. In his farewell address to the nation, President George Washington warned Americans to be constantly awake, since history and experience prove that foreign influence is one of the most baneful foes of Republican government. Alexander Hamilton cautioned that the most deadly adversaries of Republican government may come chiefly from the desire in foreign powers to gain an improper ascendant in our councils. James Madison worried that a future president could betray his trust to foreign powers, which might be fatal to the Republic, and of particular relevance now. In their personal correspondence about foreign interference, Thomas Jefferson and John Adams discussed their apprehension that as often as elections happen, the danger of foreign influence recurs. Guided by these concerns, the framers included within the Constitution various mechanisms to ensure the president's accountability and protect against foreign influence, including a requirement that presidents be natural-born citizens of the United States, prohibitions on the president's receipt of gifts, emoluments, or titles from foreign states, prohibitions on profiting from the presidency, and, of course, the requirement that the president face re-election after a 4-year term. But the framers provided for impeachment as a final check on a president who sought foreign interference to serve his personal interests, particularly to secure his own re-election. In drafting the impeachment clause, the framers adopted a standard flexible enough to reach the full range of potential presidential misconduct, treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. The decision to denote treason and bribery as impeachable conduct reflects the founding-era concerns over foreign influence and corruption. But the framers also recognized that many great and dangerous offenses could warrant impeachment and immediate removal of a president from office. These other high crimes and misdemeanors provided for by the Constitution need not be indictable criminal offenses. Rather, as Hamilton explained, impeachable offenses involve an abuse or violation of some public trust and are of a nature which may, with peculiar propriety, be denominated political, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to the society itself. The framers thus understood that high crimes and misdemeanors would encompass acts committed by public officials that inflict severe harm on the constitutional order. 2. The House's impeachment of President Donald J. Trump and the presentation of this matter to the Senate. Committees of the House have undertaken investigations into allegations of misconduct by President Trump and his administration. On September 9, 2019, after evidence surfaced that the president and his associates were seeking Ukraine's assistance in the president's re-election, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, together with the Committees on Oversight and Reform and Foreign Affairs, announced a joint investigation into the president's conduct and issued document requests to the White House and State Department. On September 24, 2019, Speaker Nancy Pelosi announced that the House was moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry and directed the committees to proceed with their investigations under the umbrella of an impeachment inquiry. They subsequently issued multiple subpoenas for documents as well as requests for subpoenas for witness interviews and testimony. On October 31, 2019, the House approved a resolution adopting procedures to govern the impeachment inquiry. Both before and after Speaker Pelosi's announcement, President Trump categorically refused to provide any information in response to the House inquiry. He stated that we're fighting all the subpoenas and that I have an Article 2 where I have the right to do whatever I want as president. Through his White House counsel, the president later directed his administration not to cooperate. Heeding the president's directive, the executive branch did not produce any documents in response to subpoenas issued by the 3 investigating committees, and 9 current or former administration officials, including the president's top aides, continued to refuse to comply with subpoenas for testimony. Notwithstanding the president's attempted cover-up, 17 current and former government officials courageously complied with their legal obligations and testified before the 3 investigating committees in depositions or transcribed interviews that all members of the committees, as well as staff from the majority and minority, were permitted to attend. Some witnesses produced documentary evidence in their possession. In late November 2019, 12 of these witnesses, including 3 requested by the minority, testified in public hearings convened by the Intelligence Committee, stressing the overwhelming evidence of misconduct already uncovered by the investigation. On December 3, 2019, the Intelligence Committee released a detailed, nearly 300-page report documenting its findings, which it transmitted to the Judiciary Committee. The Judiciary Committee held public hearings evaluating the constitutional standard for impeachment and the evidence against President Trump, in which the President's counsel was invited but declined to participate, and then reported 2 articles of impeachment to the House. On December 18, 2019, the House voted to impeach President Trump and adopted 2 articles of impeachment. The first article for abuse of power states that President Trump abused the power of the presidency by soliciting the government of Ukraine to publicly announce investigations that would benefit his reelection, harm the election prospects of a political opponent, and influence the 2020 United States presidential election to his advantage. President Trump sought to pressure the government of Ukraine to take these steps by conditioning official United States government acts of significant value to Ukraine on its public announcement of the investigations. President Trump undertook these acts for corrupt purposes in pursuit of personal political benefit, and used the powers of the presidency in a manner that compromised the national security of the United States and undermined the integrity of the United States democratic process. These actions were consistent with President Trump's previous invitations of foreign interference in United States elections, and demonstrated that President Trump will remain a threat to national security and the Constitution if allowed to remain in office. The second article for obstruction of Congress states that President Trump abused the power of the presidency in a manner offensive to and subversive of the Constitution, when he directed the unprecedented, categorical, and indiscriminate defiance of subpoenas issued by the House of Representatives pursuant to its sole power of impeachment. Without lawful cause or excuse, President Trump directed executive branch agencies, offices, and officials not to comply with those subpoenas, and thus interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives, and assumed to himself functions and judgments necessary to exercise the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House of Representatives. The president's complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and control the power of impeachment. President Trump's misconduct was consistent with his previous efforts to undermine United States government investigations into foreign interference in United States elections, demonstrated that he has acted in a manner grossly incompatible with self-governance, and established that he will remain a threat to the Constitution if allowed to remain in office. Argument 1. The Senate should convict President Trump of abuse of power. President Trump abused the power of the presidency by pressuring a foreign government to interfere in an American election on his behalf. He solicited this foreign interference to advance his re-election prospects at the expense of America's national security and the security of Ukraine, a vulnerable American ally at war with Russia, an American adversary. His effort to gain a personal political benefit by encouraging foreign government to undermine America's democratic process strikes at the core of misconduct that the framers designed impeachment to protect against. President Trump's abuse of power requires his conviction and removal from office. An officer abuses his power if he exercises his official power to obtain an improper personal benefit while ignoring or undermining the national interest. An abuse that involves an effort to solicit foreign interference in an American election is uniquely dangerous. President Trump's misconduct is an impeachable abuse of power. A. President Trump exercised his official power to pressure Ukraine into aiding his re-election. After President Zelensky won a landslide victory in Ukraine in April 2019, President Trump pressured the new Ukrainian president to help him win his own re-election by announcing investigations that were politically favorable for President Trump and designed to harm his political rival. First, President Trump sought to pressure President Zelensky publicly to announce on an investigation into former Vice President Biden and a Ukrainian gas company, Burisma Holdings, on whose board Biden's son sat. As Vice President, Biden had, in late 2015, encouraged the government of Ukraine to remove Ukrainian Prosecutor General who had failed to combat corruption. The Ukrainian parliament removed the prosecutor in March 2016. President Trump and his allies have asserted that the former vice president acted in order to stop an investigation of Burisma and thereby protect his son. This is false. There is no evidence that Vice President Biden acted improperly. He was carrying out official United States policy with the backing of the international community and bipartisan support in Congress when he sought the removal of the prosecutor who was himself corrupt. In addition, the prosecutor's removal made it more likely that the investigations into Burisma would be pursued. President Trump nevertheless sought an official Ukrainian announcement of an investigation into this theory. Second, President Trump sought to pressure President Zelensky publicly to announce an investigation into a conspiracy theory that Ukraine had colluded with the Democratic National Committee to interfere in the 2016 U.S. presidential election in order to help the campaign of Hillary Clinton against then-candidate Donald Trump. This theory was not only pure fiction, but malign Russian propaganda. In the words of President Trump's own top National Security Council official, President Trump's theory of Ukrainian election interference is a fictional narrative that is being perpetrated and propagated by the Russian security services themselves to deflect from Russia's culpability to drive a wedge between the United States and Ukraine. President Trump's own FBI director confirmed that American law enforcement has no information that indicates that Ukraine interfered with the 2016 presidential election. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence similarly concluded that Russia, not Ukraine, interfered in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. President Trump, nevertheless, seized on the false theory and sought an announcement of an investigation that would give him a basis to assert that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 election. Such an investigation would eliminate a perceived threat to his own legitimacy and boost his political standing in advance of the 2020 election. In furtherance of a corrupt scheme, President Trump exercised his official power to remove a perceived obstacle to Ukraine's pursuit of the two sham investigations. On April 24, 2019, one day after the media reported that former Vice President Biden would formally enter the 2020 U.S. presidential race, the State Department executed President Trump's order to recall the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, a well-regarded career diplomat and anti-corruption crusader. President Trump needed her out of the way because she was going to make investigations difficult for everybody. President Trump then proceeded to exercise his official power to pressure Ukraine into announcing his desired investigations by withholding valuable support that Ukraine desperately needed and that he could leverage only by virtue of his office. $391 million in security assistance and a White House meeting. President Trump illegally ordered the Office of Management and Budget to withhold $391 million in taxpayer-funded military and other security assistance to Ukraine. This assistance would provide Ukraine with sniper rifles, rocket-propelled grenade launchers, counter-artillery radars, electronic warfare detection, and secure communications and night vision equipment, among other military equipment, to defend itself against Russian forces that occupied part of eastern Ukraine since 2014. The new and vulnerable government headed by President Zelensky urgently needed this assistance, both because the funding itself was critically important to defend against Russia and because the funding was a highly visible sign of American support for President Zelensky in his efforts to negotiate an end to the conflict from a position of strength. Every relevant executive branch agency supported the assistance, which also had the broad bipartisan support in Congress. President Trump, however, personally ordered OMB to withhold the assistance after the bulk of it had been appropriated by Congress and all of the congressionally mandated conditions on assistance, including anti-corruption reforms, had been met. The Government Accountability Office has determined that the president's hold was illegal and violated the Impound Control Act, which limits the president's authority to withhold funds that Congress has appropriated. The evidence is clear that President Trump conditioned release of the military assistance on Ukraine's announcement of the sham investigations. During a telephone conversation between the two presidents on July 25th and immediately after, President Zelensky raised the issue of U.S. military support for Ukraine. President Trump replied, "I would like you to do us a favor, though." President Trump then explained that the favor he wanted President Zelensky to perform was to begin the investigations. And President Zelensky confirmed his understanding that the investigations should be done openly. In describing whom he wanted Ukraine to investigate, President Trump mentioned only two people, former Vice President Biden and his son. In describing the claim of foreign interference in the 2016 election, President Trump declared, "They say a lot of it started with Ukraine, and that whatever you can do, it's very important that you do it if that's possible." Absent from the discussion was any mention by President Trump of anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine. One of President Trump's chief agents for carrying out the president's agenda in Ukraine, Ambassador Gordon Sondland, testified that the President Trump's effort to condition release of the much-needed security assistance on an announcement of the investigations was a clear 2 + 2 = 4. Sondland communicated to President Zelensky's advisor that Ukraine would likely not receive assistance unless President Zelensky publicly announced the investigations. And President Trump later confirmed to Ambassador Sondland that President Zelensky must announce the opening of the investigations, and he should want to do it. President Trump ultimately released the military assistance, but only after the press publicly reported the hold, and the president learned that a whistleblower within the intelligence community had filed a complaint about his misconduct, and after the House publicly announced an investigation of the president's scheme. In short, President Trump released the security assistance for Ukraine only after he got caught. Withheld White House meeting. On April 21, 2019, the day President Zelensky was elected, President Trump invited him to a meeting at the White House. The meeting would have signaled American support for the new Ukrainian administration, its strong anti-corruption reform agenda, and its efforts to defend against Russian aggression and to make peace. President Trump, however, exercised his official power to withhold the meeting as leverage in his scheme to pressure President Zelensky into announcing the investigations to help his reelection campaign. The evidence is unambiguous that President Trump and his agents conditioned the White House meeting on Ukraine's announcement of the investigations. Ambassador Sondland testified that President Trump wanted a public statement from President Zelensky committing to the investigations as a prerequisite for the White House meeting. Ambassador Sondland further testified, "I know that members of this committee frequently frame these complicated issues in the form of a simple question: was there quid pro quo? As I testified previously, with regard to the requested White House call and the White House meeting, the answer is yes." To this day, President Trump maintains leverage over President Zelensky, a White House meeting still has not taken place, and President Trump continues publicly to urge Ukraine to conduct these investigations. B. President Trump exercised official power to benefit himself personally. Overwhelming evidence demonstrates that the announcement of the investigations on which President Trump conditioned the official acts had no legitimate policy rationale, and instead were corruptly intended to assist his 2020 reelection campaign. First, although there was no basis for the two conspiracy theories that President Trump advanced, public announcements that these theories were being investigated would be of immense political value to him, and him alone. The public announcement of an investigation of former Vice President Biden would yield enormous political benefits for President Trump, who viewed the former Vice President as a serious political rival in the 2020 U.S. presidential election. Unsurprisingly, President Trump's efforts to advance the conspiracy theory accelerated after news broke that Vice President Biden would run for president in 2020. President Trump benefited from such an announcement of a criminal investigation into his presidential opponent in 2016. An announcement of a criminal investigation regarding a 2020 rival would likely be extremely helpful to his re-election prospects. President Trump would similarly have viewed an investigation into Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election as helpful in undermining the conclusion that he had benefited from Russian election interference in 2016, and that he was the preferred candidate of President Putin, both of which President Trump viewed as calling into question the legitimacy of his presidency. An announcement that Ukraine was investigating its own alleged 2016 election interference would have turned these facts on their head. President Trump would have grounds to claim, falsely, that he was elected president in 2016 not because he was the beneficiary of Russian election interference, but in spite of Ukrainian election interference aimed at helping his opponent. Second, agents and associates of President Trump who helped carry out his agenda in Ukraine confirmed that his efforts to pressure President Zelensky into announcing the desired investigations were intended for his personal political benefit rather than for a legitimate policy purpose. For example, after speaking with President Trump, Ambassador Sondland told a colleague that President Trump did not give an expletive about Ukraine, and instead only cared about the big stuff that benefited him personally, like the Biden investigation that Mr. Giuliani was pushing. And Mick Mulvaney, President Trump's acting chief of staff, acknowledged to a reporter that there was quid pro quo with Ukraine involving military aid and conceded there is going to be political influence in foreign policy and stated, "I have news for everybody. Get over it." Third, the involvement of President Trump's personal attorney, Mr. Giuliani, who has professional obligations to the president but not the nation, underscores that President Trump sought the investigations for political and personal reasons rather than legitimate foreign policy reasons. Mr. Giuliani openly and repeatedly acknowledged that he was pursuing the Ukrainian investigation to advance the president's interests, stating, "This isn't foreign policy." Instead, Mr. Giuliani said that he was seeking information that will be very, very helpful to my client. Mr. Giuliani made similar representations to the Ukrainian government. In a letter to President-elect Zelensky, Mr. Giuliani stated that he represented him, President Trump, as a private citizen, not as President of the United States, and was acting with the President's knowledge and consent. President Trump placed Mr. Giuliani at the hub of the pressure campaign on Ukraine and directed U.S. officials responsible for Ukraine to talk to Rudy. Indeed, during their July 25th call, President Trump pressed President Zelensky to speak with Mr. Giuliani directly, stating, "Rudy very much knows what's happening, and he is a very capable guy. If you could speak to him, that would be great." Fourth, President Trump's pursuit of the sham investigations marked a dramatic deviation from long-standing bipartisan American foreign policy goals in Ukraine. Legitimate investigations could have been recognized as an anti-corruption foreign policy goal, but there was no factual basis for an investigation into the Bidens or into supposed Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election. To the contrary, the requested investigations were precisely the type of political investigations that American foreign policy dissuades other countries from undertaking. That explains why the scheme to obtain the announcements was pursued through the president's chosen political appointees and his personal attorney. Why Trump administration officials attempted to keep the scheme from becoming public due to its sensitive nature. Why no credible explanation for the hold on security assistance was provided, even within the U.S. government. Why, over Department of Defense objections, President Trump and his allies violated the law by withholding the aid. And why, after the scheme was uncovered, President Trump falsely claimed that his pursuit of the investigations did not involve quid pro quo. Fifth, American and Ukraine officials alike saw President Trump's scheme for what it was, improper and political. As we expect the testimony of Ambassador John Bolton would confirm, President Trump's national security advisor stated that he wanted no part of whatever drug deal President Trump's agents were pursuing in Ukraine. Dr. Hill testified that Ambassador Sondland was becoming involved in a domestic political errand, in pressing Ukraine to announce the investigations. Jennifer Williams, an advisor to President Pence, testified that the president's solicitation of investigations was of a domestic political matter. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vidman, the NSC's director for Ukraine, testified that it is improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen and a political opponent. William Taylor, who took over as chargé d'affaires in Kiev after President Trump recalled Ambassador Yovanovitch, emphasized that "I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign." And George Kent, a State Department official, testified that Asking another country to investigate a prosecution for political reason undermines our advocacy of the rule of law. Ukrainian officials also understood that President Trump's corrupt effort to solicit the sham investigations would drag them into domestic U.S. politics. In response to the president's efforts, a senior Ukrainian official conveyed to Ambassador Taylor that President Zelensky did not want to be used as a pawn in a U.S. reelection campaign. Another Ukrainian official later stated that it's critically important for the West not to pull us into some conflicts between their ruling elites. And when Ambassador Kurt Volker tried to warn President Zelensky's advisor against investigating President Zelensky's former political opponent, the prior Ukrainian president, the advisor retorted, "What? You mean like asking us to investigate Clinton and Biden?" David Holmes, a career diplomat at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, highlighted this hypocrisy. While we had advised our Ukrainian counterparts to voice a commitment to following the rule of law and generally investigating credible corruption allegations, U.S. officials were making a demand that President Zelensky personally commit on a cable news channel to a specific investigation of President Trump's political rival. Finally, there is no credible alternative explanation for President Trump's conduct. It is not credible that President Trump sought announcements of the investigation because he was, in fact, concerned with corruption in Ukraine or burden sharing with our European allies, as he claimed after the scheme was uncovered. Before news of former Vice President Biden's candidacy broke, President Trump showed no interest in corruption in Ukraine, and in prior years he approved military assistance to Ukraine without controversy. After his candidacy was announced, President Trump remained indifferent to anti-corruption measures beyond the two investigations that he was demanding. When he first spoke with President Zelensky on April 21st, President Trump ignored the recommendation of his national security advisors and did not mention corruption at all, even though the purpose of the call was to congratulate President Zelensky on a victory based on an anti-corruption platform. President Trump's entire policy team agreed that President Zelensky was genuinely committed to reforms. Yet, President Trump refused a White House meeting that the team advised would support President Zelensky's anti-corruption agenda. President Trump's own Department of Defense, in consultation with the State Department, had certified in May 2019 that Ukraine satisfied all anti-corruption standards needed to receive the congressionally appropriated military aid. Yet, President Trump nevertheless withheld that vital assistance. He recalled without explanation Ambassador Yovanovitch, who was widely recognized as a champion in fighting corruption, disparaged her while praising a corrupt Ukrainian prosecutor general, and oversaw efforts to cut foreign programs tasked with combating corruption in Ukraine and elsewhere. Moreover, had President Trump truly sought to assist Ukraine's anti-corruption efforts, he would have focused on ensuring that Ukraine actually conducted investigations of the purported issues he identified. But actual investigations were never the point. President Trump was interested only in the announcement of the investigations, because that announcement would accomplish his real goal, bolstering his reelection efforts. President Trump's purported concerns about sharing the burden of assistance to Ukraine with Europe is equally without basis. From the time OMB announced the illegal hold until it was lifted, no credible reason was provided to executive branch agencies for the hold, despite repeated efforts by national security officials to obtain an explanation. It was not until September, approximately 2 months after President Trump had directed the hold and after the president had learned of the whistleblower complaint, that the hold, for the first time, was attributed to the president's concern about other countries not contributing more to Ukraine. If the president was genuinely concerned about burden sharing, it makes no sense that he kept his own administration in the dark about the issue for months, never made any contemporaneous public statements about it, never ordered a review of burden sharing, never ordered his officials to push Europe to increase their contributions, and then released aid without any change in Europe's contribution. The concern over burden sharing is an after-the-fact rationalization designed to conceal President Trump's abuse of power. C. President Trump jeopardized U.S. national interests. President Trump's efforts to solicit foreign interference to help his re-election campaign is pernicious, but his conduct is all the more alarming because it endangered U.S. national security, jeopardized our alliances, and undermined our efforts to promote the rule of law globally. Ukraine is a strategic partner of the United States on the front lines of an ongoing conflict with Russia. The United States has approved military assistance to Ukraine with bipartisan support since 2014, and that assistance is critical to preventing Russia's expansion and aggression. This military assistance, which President Trump withheld in service of his own political interests, saves lives by making Ukrainian resistance to Russia more effective. It likewise advances American national security interests because if Russia prevails and Ukraine falls to Russian dominion, we can expect to see other attempts by Russia to expand its territory and influence. Indeed, the reason the United States provides assistance to the Ukrainian military is so that they can fight Russia over there, and we don't have to fight Russia here. President Trump's delay in providing the military assistance jeopardized these national security interests and emboldened Russia, even though the funding was ultimately released, particularly because the delay occurred when Russia was watching closely to gauge the level of American support for the Ukrainian government. But for a subsequent act of Congress, approximately $35 million of military assistance to Ukraine would have lapsed and been unavailable as a result of the president's abuse of power. The White House meeting that President Trump promised President Zelensky, but continues to withhold, would similarly have signaled to Russia that the United States stands behind Ukraine, showing U.S. support at the highest levels. By refusing to hold this meeting, President Trump denied Ukraine a showing of strength that could defer further Russian aggression and help Ukraine negotiate a favorable end to its war with Russia. The withheld meeting also undercuts President Zelensky's domestic standing, diminishing his ability to advance his ambitious anti-corruption reforms. Equally troubling is that President Trump's scheme sent a clear message to our allies that the United States may capriciously withhold critical assistance for the president's personal benefit, causing our allies to constantly question the extent to which they can count on us. Because American leadership depends on the power of our example and the consistency of our purpose. President Trump's conduct undermines the U.S., exposes our friends, and widens the playing field for autocrats like President Putin. And President Trump's use of political acts to pressure Ukraine to announce politically motivated investigations harms our credibility in promoting democratic values and the rule of law in Ukraine and around the world. American credibility abroad is based on a respect for the United States. And if we damage that respect, American foreign policy cannot do its job. President Trump abused the powers of his office to invite foreign interference in an election for his own personal gain and to the detriment of American national security interests. He abandoned his oath to faithfully execute the laws and betrayed his public trust. President Trump's misconduct presents a danger to our democratic processes, our national security, and our commitment to the rule of law. He must be removed from office. 2. The Senate should convict President Trump of obstruction of Congress. In exercising its responsibility to investigate and consider the impeachment of a president of the United States, the House is constitutionally entitled to relevant information from the executive branch concerning the president's misconduct. The framers, the courts, and past presidents have recognized that honoring Congress's right to information in an impeachment investigation is a critical safeguard in our system of divided powers. Otherwise, a president could hide his own wrongdoing to prevent Congress from discovering impeachable conduct, effectively nullifying Congress's impeachment power. President Trump's sweeping effort to shield his misconduct from view and protect himself from impeachment thus works a grave constitutional harm and is itself an impeachable offense. A. The House is constitutionally entitled to the relevant information in an impeachment inquiry. The House has the power to issue subpoenas and demand compliance in an impeachment investigation. The Supreme Court has long recognized that without the power to investigate, including, of course, the authority to compel testimony, either through its own processes or through judicial trial, Congress could be seriously handicapped in its efforts to exercise its constitutional functions wisely and effectively. The Court has stressed that it is the duty of all citizens and their unremitting obligation to respond to subpoenas, to respect the dignity of Congress and its committees, and to testify fully with respect to matters within the province of proper investigation. The Court has repeatedly emphasized that Congress' power of inquiry with process to enforce it is an essential and appropriate auxiliary to the legislative function. Congress cannot legislate wisely or effectively in the absence of information. This principle is most compelling when the House exercises its sole power of impeachment. Congress's already broad investigatory authority and its need for information are at their apex in an impeachment inquiry. The principle that the president cannot stand in the way of an impeachment investigation is of great consequence, because as Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story long ago explained, the president should not have the power of preventing a thorough investigation of his conduct, or of securing himself against the disgrace of a public conviction by impeachment if he should deserve it. A presidential impeachment is a matter of the most critical moment to the nation, and it is difficult to conceive of a more compelling need than that of this country for an unswerving, fair inquiry based on all the pertinent information. The Supreme Court thus recognized nearly 140 years ago that where the House or Senate is determining a question of impeachment, there is no reason to doubt the right to compel the attendance of witnesses and their answers to proper questions in the same manner and by the use of the same means that the courts of justice can in like cases. Like the Supreme Court, members of the earliest Congresses understand that without the right to inspect every paper and transaction in any department, the power of impeachment could never be exercised with any effect. Previous presidents have acknowledged their obligation to comply with an impeachment investigation, explaining that such an inquiry penetrates into the most secret recesses of the executive departments and could command the attendance of any and every agent of the government and compel them to produce all papers, public or private, official or unofficial, and to testify on oath to all facts within their knowledge. That acknowledgement is a matter of common sense. An impeachment inquiry cannot root out bad actors if those same bad actors control the scope and nature of the inquiry. President Trump is an aberration among presidents in refusing any and all cooperation in a House impeachment investigation. Even President Nixon produced numerous documents in response to congressional subpoenas and instructed all members of the White House staff to appear voluntarily when requested by the House, to testify under oath, and to answer fully all proper questions, consistent with the near uniform cooperation of prior executive branch officials who have been subject to impeachment investigations. Because President Nixon's production of records in response to the House Judiciary Committee's inquiry was incomplete in important respects, however, the committee voted to adopt an article of impeachment for his obstruction of the inquiry. As the committee explained, in refusing to provide materials that the committee deemed necessary to the impeachment investigation, President Nixon had substituted his judgment for that of the House and interposed the powers of the presidency against the lawful subpoenas of the House of Representatives, thereby assuming to himself functions and judgments necessary to exercise the sole power of impeachment vested by the Constitution in the House. The committee stated that it was not within the power of the president to conduct an inquiry into his own impeachment, to determine which evidence and what version or portion of that evidence is relevant and necessary to such an inquiry. These are matters which, under the Constitution, the House has sole power to determine. In the face of Congress's investigation and mounting evidence of his misdeeds, President Nixon resigned before the House had a chance to impeach him for his misconduct. B. President Trump's obstruction of the impeachment inquiry violates fundamental constitutional principles. The Senate should convict President Trump of obstruction of Congress as charged in the second article of impeachment. President Trump unilaterally declared the House investigation illegitimate. President Trump's White House counsel notified the House that President Trump cannot permit his administration to participate in this partisan inquiry under these circumstances. President Trump then directed his administration categorically to withhold documents and testimony from the House. The facts are undisputed. As charged in the second article of impeachment, President Trump directed the White House to defy a lawful subpoena by withholding the production of documents to the committees, directed other executive branch agencies and offices to defy lawful subpoenas and withhold the production of documents and records from the committees, and directed current and former executive branch officials not to cooperate with the committees. In response to President Trump's directives, OMB, the Department of State, Department of Energy, Department of Defense refused to produce any documents to the House, even though witness testimony has revealed that additional highly relevant records exist. To date, the House committee has not received a single document or record from these departments and agencies pursuant to subpoenas which remain in effect. President Trump personally demanded that his top aides refuse to testify in response to subpoenas, and 9 administration officials followed his directive and continued to defy subpoenas for their testimony. For example, when the Intelligence Committee issued a subpoena for Mick Mulvaney's testimony, he produced a November 8th letter from the White House stating the President directs Mr. Mulvaney not to appear at the committee's scheduled deposition on November 8, 2019. When President Trump was unable to silence witnesses, he resorted to tactics to penalize and intimidate them. These efforts include President Trump's sustained attacks on the anonymous whistleblower and his public statements designed to discourage witnesses from coming forward and to embarrass those who did testify. Refusing to comply with a congressional impeachment investigation is not a constitutionally valid decision for a president to make. President Trump's unprecedented complete defiance of an impeachment inquiry served to cover up the president's own repeated misconduct and to seize and to control the power of impeachment. President Trump's directive rejects one of the key features distinguishing our republic from a monarchy, that the President of the United States is liable to be impeached, tried, and upon conviction removed. Allowing President Trump to avoid conviction on the second article would set a dangerous precedent for future presidents to hide their misconduct from congressional scrutiny during an impeachment inquiry without fear of accountability. Notwithstanding President Trump's obstruction, the House obtained compelling evidence that he abused power. The failure of President Trump's obstruction and attempted cover-up, however, does not excuse his misconduct. There can be no doubt that the withheld documents and the testimony would provide Congress with highly pertinent information about the president's corrupt scheme. Indeed, witnesses have testified about specific withheld records concerning President Trump's July 25th call with President Zelensky and related materials. And public reports have referred to additional responsive documents, including hundreds of documents that reveal extensive efforts to generate an after-the-fact justification for withholding security aid. C. President Trump's excuses for his obstruction are meritless. President Trump has offered various unpersuasive excuses for his blanket refusal to comply with the House's impeachment inquiry. President Trump's refusal to provide information is not a principled assertion of executive privilege, but rather is a transparent attempt to cover up wrongdoing and amass power that the Constitution does not give him, including the power to decide whether and when Congress can hold him accountable. First, while congressional investigators often accommodate legitimate executive branch interests, the president's blanket directive to all executive branch agencies and witnesses to defy congressional subpoenas was not based on any actual assertion of executive privilege or identification of particular sensitive information. The White House counsel's letter alluded to long-established executive branch confidentiality interest and privileges that the State Department could theoretically invoke, and the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel preemptively dismissed certain subpoenas as invalid on the ground that the responsive information was potentially protected by executive privilege. But neither document conveyed an actual assertion of executive privilege, which would require, at a minimum, identification by the president of particular communications or documents containing protected material. The White House cannot justify a blanket refusal to respond to congressional subpoenas based on an executive or other privilege it never, in fact, invoked. Regardless, executive privilege is inapplicable here, both because it may not be used to conceal wrongdoing, particularly in an impeachment inquiry, and because the president and his agents have already diminished any confidentiality interest by speaking at length about these events in every forum except Congress. President Trump has been impeached for obstruction of Congress, not based upon discrete invocations of privilege or immunity, but for his directive that the executive branch categorically stonewall the House impeachment inquiry by refusing to comply with all subpoenas. To the extent President Trump claims that he has concealed evidence to protect the office of the president, the framers considered and rejected that defense. Several delegates at the Constitutional Convention warned that the impeachment power would be destructive of the executive independence. But the framers adopted an impeachment power anyway because, as Alexander Hamilton observed, the powers relating to impeachments are an essential check in the hands of Congress upon the encroachments of the executive. The impeachment power does not exist to protect the presidency. It exists to protect the nation from a corrupt and dangerous president like Donald Trump. Second, President Trump has no basis for objecting to how the House conducted its impeachment proceedings. The Constitution vests the House with the sole power of impeachment and the power to determine the rules of its proceedings. The rights that President Trump has demanded has never been recognized and have not been afforded in any prior presidential impeachment. President Trump has been afforded protections equal to or greater than those afforded Presidents Nixon and Clinton during their impeachment proceedings in the House. Any claim that President Trump was entitled to due process rights modeled on a criminal trial during the entirety of the House impeachment inquiry ignores both law and history. A House impeachment inquiry cannot be compared to a criminal trial because the Senate, not the House, possesses the sole power to try impeachments. The Constitution does not entitle President Trump to separate full trial first in the House. Even indulging the analogy to a criminal trial, no person appearing before a prosecutor or grand jury deciding whether to bring charges would have the rights President Trump has claimed. As the House Judiciary Committee chairman observed during Watergate, it is not a right but a privilege or a courtesy for the president to participate through counsel in House impeachment proceedings. President Trump's demands are just another effort to obstruct the House in the exercise of its constitutional duty. Third, the President Trump's assertion that his impeachment for obstruction of Congress is invalid because the committees did not first seek judicial enforcement of their subpoena ignores again the constitutional dictate that the House has sole authority to determine how to proceed with an impeachment. It also ignores President Trump's own arguments to the federal courts. President Trump is telling one story to Congress while spinning a different tale in the courts. He is saying to Congress that the committee should have sued the executive branch in court to enforce their subpoenas. But he has argued to that court that congressional committees cannot sue the executive branch to enforce their subpoenas. President Trump cannot tell Congress that it must pursue him in court while simultaneously telling the courts that they are powerless to enforce congressional subpoenas. President Trump's approach to the judicial branch thus mirrors his obstruction of the legislative branch. In his view, neither can engage in any review of his conduct. This position conveys the president's dangerously misguided belief that no other branch of government may check his power or hold him accountable for abusing it. That belief is fundamentally incompatible with our form of government. Months or years of litigation over each of the House subpoenas is in any event no answer to this time-sensitive inquiry. The House subpoenas to former White House counsel Don McGahn was issued on April 2019, but it is still winding its way through the courts over President Trump's strong opposition, even on an expedited schedule. Litigating President Trump's direction that each subpoena be denied would conflict with the House's urgent duty to act on the compelling evidence of impeachable misconduct that it has uncovered. Further delay also compromises the integrity of the 2020 elections. When the framers entrusted the House with the sole power of impeachment, they obviously meant to equip the House with the necessary tools to discover abuses of power by the president. Without that authority, the impeachment clause would fail as an effective safeguard against tyranny. a system in which the president cannot be charged with a crime, as the Department of Justice believes, and in which he can nullify the impeachment power through blanket obstruction, as President Trump has done here, is a system in which the president is above the law. The Senate should convict President Trump for his categorical obstruction of the House's impeachment inquiry and ensure that this president and any future president cannot commit impeachable offenses and then avoid accountability by covering them up. 3. The Senate should immediately remove President Trump from office to prevent further abuses. President Trump has demonstrated his continued willingness to corrupt free and fair elections, betray our national security, and subvert the constitutional separations of power, all for personal gain. President Trump's ongoing pattern of misconduct demonstrates that he is an immediate threat to the nation and the rule of law. It is imperative that the Senate convict and remove him from office now and permanently bar him from holding federal office. A. President Trump's repeated abuse of power presents an ongoing threat to our election. President Trump's solicitation of Ukrainian interference in the 2020 election is not an isolated incident. It is part of his ongoing and deeply troubling course of misconduct that, as the first article of impeachment states, is consistent with President Trump's previous invitation of foreign interference in United States elections. These previous efforts include inviting Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. As Special Counsel Mueller concluded, the Russian government interfered in the 2016 presidential election in a sweeping and systematic fashion. Throughout the 2016 election cycle, the Trump campaign maintained significant contacts with agents of the Russian government who were offering damaging information concerning then-candidate Trump's political opponent, and Mr. Trump repeatedly praised and even publicly requested the release of politically charged Russian-hacked emails. The Trump campaign welcomed Russian interference because it expected it would benefit electorally from information stolen and released through Russian efforts. President Trump's recent actions confirm that public censure is insufficient to deter him from continuing to facilitate foreign interference in U.S. elections. In June 2019, President Trump declared that he sees nothing wrong with listening to a foreign power that offers information detrimental to a political adversary. In the president's words, "I think I'd take it." Asked whether such information should be reported to law enforcement, President Trump retorted, "Give me a break. Life doesn't work that way." Only one day after Special Counsel Mueller testified to Congress that the Trump campaign welcomed and sought to capitalize on Russia's efforts to damage the president's political rival in 2016, President Trump spoke to President Zelensky, pressuring Ukraine to announce investigations to damage President Trump's political opponent in the 2020 election and undermine Special Counsel Mueller's findings. President Trump still embraces that call as both routine and perfect. President Trump's conduct would have horrified the framers of our republic. In its findings, the Intelligence Committee emphasized the proximate threat of further presidential attempts to solicit foreign interference in our next election. That threat has not abated. In a sign that President Trump's corrupt efforts to encourage interference in the 2020 election persist, he reiterated his desire for Ukraine to investigate his political opponents even after the scheme was discovered and the impeachment inquiry was announced. When asked in October 2019 what he hoped President Zelensky would do about the Bidens, President Trump answered that it was very simple, and he hoped Ukraine would start a major investigation. Unsolicited, he added that China should likewise start an investigation into the Bidens. President Trump has also continued to engage Mr. Giuliani to pursue the sham investigations on his behalf. One day after President Trump was impeached, Mr. Giuliani claimed that he had gathered derogatory evidence against Vice President Biden during a fact-finding trip to Ukraine, a trip where he met with current Ukrainian official who attended a KGB school in Moscow and has led calls in Ukraine to investigate the Burisma and the Bidens. During the trip, Mr. Giuliani tweeted, "The conversation about corruption in Ukraine was based on compelling evidence of criminal conduct by then Vice President Biden in 2016 that has not been resolved, and until it is, will be a major obstacle to the U.S. assisting Ukraine with its anti-corruption reforms." Not only was Mr. Giuliani perpetrating the false allegations against the former vice president, but he was reiterating the threat that President Trump had used to pressure President Zelensky to announce the investigation, that U.S. assistance to Ukraine would be withheld until Ukraine pursued the sham investigations. Mr. Giuliani has stated that he and the president continue to be on the same page. Ukraine, as well, understands that Mr. Giuliani represents President Trump's interests. President Trump's unrepentant embrace of foreign election interference illustrates the threat posed by his continued occupancy of the office of the president. It also refutes the assertion that the consequences of his misconduct should be decided by the voters in the 2020 election. The aim of President Trump's Ukraine scheme was to corrupt the integrity of the 2020 election by enlisting a foreign power to give him an unfair advantage. In short, to cheat. That threat persists today. B. President Trump's obstruction of Congress threatens our constitutional order. President Trump's obstruction of the House impeachment inquiry, intended to hold him accountable for his misconduct, presents a serious danger to our constitutional checks and balances. President Trump has made clear that he refuses to accept Congress's express and exclusive constitutional role in conducting impeachments. He has thereby subverted the Constitution that he pledged to uphold when he was inaugurated on the steps of the Capitol. By his words and deeds, President Trump has obstructed the House's impeachment inquiry at every turn. He has dismissed impeachment as an illegal, invalid, and unconstitutional, directed the executive branch not to comply with House subpoenas for documents and testimony, and intimidated and threatened the anonymous intelligence community whistleblower, as well as patriotic public servants who honored their subpoenas and testified before the House. President Trump's obstruction is part of an ominous pattern of efforts to undermine the United States government investigations into foreign interference in the United States elections. Rather than assist Special Counsel Mueller's investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election and his own campaign's exploitation of that foreign assistance,
President Trump repeatedly used the powers of his office to impede it. Among other actions, President Trump directed the White House counsel to fire the special counsel and then create a false record of the firing, tampered with witnesses in the special counsel's investigation, and repeatedly and publicly attacked the legitimacy of the investigation. President Trump has instructed the former White House counsel to defy a House committee subpoena for testimony concerning these matters, and the Department of Justice has argued that the courts cannot even hear the committee's action to enforce its subpoena. President Trump's current obstruction of Congress is, therefore, not the first time he has committed misconduct concerning a federal investigation into election interference and then sought to hide it. Allowing this pattern to continue without repercussion would send the clear message that President Trump is correct, and in his view that no governmental body can hold him accountable for wrongdoing. That view is erroneous and exceptionally dangerous. C. The Senate should convict and remove President Trump to protect our national system of government and national security interest. The Senate should convict and remove President Trump to avoid serious and long-term damage to our democratic values and the nation's security. If the Senate permits President Trump to remain in office, he and future leaders would be emboldened to welcome and even enlist foreign interference in elections for years to come. When the American people's faith in their electoral process is shaken and its results called into question, the essence of democratic self-government is called into doubt. Failure to remove President Trump would signal that a president's personal interest may take precedence over those of the nation, alarming our allies and emboldening our adversaries. Our leadership depends on the power of our example and the consistency of our purpose. But because of President Trump's actions, both have now been open to question. Ratifying President Trump's behavior would likewise erode long-standing U.S. anti-corruption policy, which encourages countries to refrain from using the criminal justice system to investigate political opponents. As many witnesses explained, urging Ukraine to engage in selective politically associated investigations or prosecutions undermines the power of America's example and our long-standing efforts to promote the rule of law abroad. An acquittal would also provide license to President Trump and his successors to use taxpayer dollars for personal political ends. Foreign aid is not the only vulnerable source of funding. President could also hold hostage federal funds earmarked for states, such as money for natural disasters, highways, and health care, unless and until state officials perform personal political favors. Any congressional appropriation would be an opportunity for a president to solicit a favor for his personal political purposes, or for others to seek to curry favor with him. Such an outcome would be entirely incompatible with our constitutional system of self-government. President Trump has betrayed the American people and the ideals on which the nation was founded. Unless he is removed from office, he will continue to endanger our national security, jeopardize the integrity of our elections, and undermine our core constitutional principles. Respectfully submitted, Adam B. Schiff, Jerrold Nadler, Zoe Lofgren, Hakeem S. Jeffries, Val Butler Demings, Jason Crow, Sylvia R. Garcia. January 18th, 2020, United States House of Representatives, managers. In the Senate of the United States, sitting as a court of impeachment. NRE, impeachment of President Donald J. Trump. Statement of material facts. Attachment to the trial memorandum of the United States House of Representatives in the impeachment trial of President Donald J. Trump. 1. President Trump's abuse of power. A. The president's scheme to solicit foreign interference in the 2020 election from the new Ukrainian government began in spring of 2019. B. The president enlisted his personal attorney and U.S. officials to help execute the scheme for his personal benefit. C. The president froze vital military and other security assistance for Ukraine. D. President Trump conditioned a White House meeting on Ukraine announcing it would launch politically motivated investigations. E. President Trump directly solicited election interference from President Zelensky. F. President Trump conditioned the release of security assistance for Ukraine and continued to leverage a White House meeting to pressure Ukraine to launch politically motivated investigations. G. President Trump was forced to lift the hold but has continued to solicit foreign interference in the upcoming election. H. President Trump's conduct was consistent with his previous invitations of foreign interference into U.S. election. 2. President Trump's obstruction of Congress. A. The House launched an impeachment inquiry. B. President Trump ordered categorical obstruction of the House's impeachment inquiry. C. Following President Trump's directive, the executive branch refused to produce requested and subpoenaed documents. D. President Trump ordered top aides not to testify, even pursuant to subpoena. E. President Trump's conduct was consistent with his previous efforts to obstruct investigations into foreign interference in U.S. elections. Introduction. The U.S. House of Representatives has adopted articles of impeachment charging President Donald J. Trump with abuse of office and obstruction of Congress. The House's trial memorandum explains why the Senate should convict and remove President Trump from office and permanently bar him from government service. The memorandum relies on this statement of material facts, which summarizes key evidence relating to the president's misconduct. As further described below, and as detailed in House committee reports, President Trump used the powers of his office and U.S. taxpayers' money to pressure a foreign country, Ukraine, to interfere in the 2020 U.S. presidential elections on his behalf. President Trump's goals, which became known to multiple U.S. officials who testified before the House, were simply and starkly political. He wanted Ukraine's new president to announce investigations that would assist his 2020 re-election campaign and tarnish a political opponent, former Vice President Joseph Biden Jr. As leverage, President Trump illegally withheld the Ukraine nearly $400 million in vital military and other security assistance that had been appropriated by Congress, and an official White House meeting that President Trump had promised Volodymyr Zelensky. the newly elected president of Ukraine. President Trump did this despite U.S. national security officials' unanimous opposition to withholding the aid from Ukraine, placing his own personal and political interest above the national security interest of the United States and undermining the integrity of our democracy. When his scheme became known and committees of the House launched an investigation, the president, for the first time in American history, ordered the categorical obstruction of an impeachment inquiry. President Trump directed that no witnesses should testify and no documents should be produced to the House, a co-equal branch of government endowed by the Constitution with the sole power of impeachment. President Trump's conduct, both in soliciting a foreign country's interference in a U.S. election and then obstructing the ensuing investigation into that interference, was consistent with his prior conduct during and after the 2016 election. Statement of material facts. 1. President Trump's abuse of power. A. The president's scheme to solicit foreign interference in the 2020 election from the new Ukrainian government began in spring 2019. 1. On April 21, 2019, Volodymyr Zelensky, a political neophyte, won a landslide victory in Ukraine's presidential election. Zelensky campaigned on an anti-corruption platform, and his victory reaffirmed the Ukrainian people's strong desire for reform. When President Trump called to congratulate Zelensky later that day, President Trump did not raise any concerns about corruption in Ukraine, although his staff had prepared written materials for him recommending that he do so, and the White House call read out incorrectly indicated that he did. 3. During the call, President Trump promised President-elect Zelensky that a high-level U.S. delegation would attend his inauguration and told him, "When you're settled in and ready, I'd like to invite you to the White House." 4. Both events would have demonstrated strong support by the United States as Ukraine fought a war and negotiated for peace with Russia. Russia was watching closely to gauge the level of American support for the Ukrainian government. A White House visit also would have bolstered Zelensky's standing at home as he pursued anti-corruption agenda. 5. Following the April 21st call, President Trump asked Vice President Mike Pence to lead the American delegation to President Zelensky's inauguration. During his own call with President-elect Zelensky on April 23rd, Vice President confirmed that he would attend the inauguration if the dates worked out. 6. On April 23rd, the media reported that former Vice President Biden was going to enter the 2020 race for the Democratic nomination for President of the United States. 7. The next day, April 24th, the State Department executed President Trump's order to recall the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Masha Yovanovitch, who was a well-regarded career diplomat and a champion for anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine. 8. The removal of Ambassador Yovanovitch was a culmination of a months-long smear campaign waged by the president's personal lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, and other allies of the president. The president also helped amplify the smear campaign. 9. Upon her return to the United States, Ambassador Yovanovitch was informed by State Department officials that there was no substantive reason or cause for her removal, but that President Trump had simply lost confidence in her. 10. Mr. Giuliani later disclosed the true motive for Ambassador Yovanovitch's removal. Mr. Giuliani believed that he needed Yovanovitch out of the way because she was going to make the investigations more difficult for everybody. 11. Mr. Giuliani was referring to two politically motivated investigations that President Trump solicited from Ukraine in order to assist his 2020 election campaign, one into former Vice President Biden and a Ukrainian gas company, Burisma Holdings, on whose board Biden's son sat. The other into a discredited conspiracy theory that Ukraine, not Russia, had interfered in the 2016 U.S. election to help Hillary Clinton's campaign. One element of the latter conspiracy theory was that CrowdStrike, a NASDAQ-listed cybersecurity firm based in Sunnyvale, California, that the president erroneously believed was owned by a Ukrainian oligarch, had colluded with the Democratic National Committee to frame Russia and help the election campaign of Hillary Clinton. 12. There was no factual basis for either investigation. As to the first, witnesses unanimously testified that there was no credible evidence to support the allegation that, in late 2015, Vice President Biden corruptly encouraged Ukraine to remove then-Prosecutor General Viktor Shokin because he was investigating Burisma. Rather, Vice President Biden was carrying out official U.S. policy with bipartisan support and promoting anti-corruption reforms in Ukraine because Shokin was viewed by the United States, its European partners, and the International Monetary Fund to be ineffectual at prosecuting corruption and was himself corrupt. In fact, witnesses unanimously testified that the removal of Shokin made it more likely that Ukraine would investigate corruption, including Burisma and its owner, not less likely. The Ukrainian parliament removed Shokin in March of 2016. 13. As to the second investigation, the U.S. intelligence community determined that Russia, not Ukraine, interfered in the 2016 election. The Senate Select Committee on Intelligence reached the same conclusion following its own lengthy bipartisan investigation. Special Counsel Robert Mueller III likewise concluded that the Russian government interfered in the 2016 presidential election in a sweeping and systematic fashion. And FBI Director Christopher Wray, a Trump appointee, recently confirmed that law enforcement has no information that indicates that Ukraine interfered with the 2016 presidential election. 14. As Dr. Fiona Hill, who served until July 2019 as the Senior Director of European and Russian Affairs at the National Security Council under President Trump until July 2019, testified, the theory of Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election is a fictional narrative that is being perpetrated and propagated by the Russian security services themselves to deflect from Russia's own culpability to drive a wedge between the United States and Ukraine. In fact, shortly after the 2016 U.S. election, this conspiracy theory was promoted by none other than President Vladimir Putin himself. On May 3, 2019, shortly after President Zelensky's election, President Trump and President Putin spoke by telephone, including about the so-called Russian hoax. 15. President Trump's senior advisors had attempted to dissuade the president from promoting this conspiracy theory to no avail. Dr. Hill testified that President Trump's former Homeland Security Advisor Tom Bossert and former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster spent a lot of time trying to refute this theory in their first year of the administration. Bossert later said the false narrative about Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election was not only a conspiracy theory, it is completely debunked. B. The president enlisted his personal attorney and U.S. officials to help execute the scheme for his personal benefit. 16. Shortly after his April 21st call with President Zelensky, President Trump began to publicly press for the two investigations he wanted Ukraine to pursue. On April 25th, the day that former Vice President announced his candidacy for the Democratic nomination for president, President Trump called into Sean Hannity's primetime Fox News show, referencing alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2000 election. President Trump said it sounds like big stuff and suggested that the Attorney General might investigate. 17. On May 6, in a separate Fox News interview, President Trump claimed Vice President Biden's advocacy for Mr. Shokin's dismissal in 2016 was a very serious problem and a major scandal. Major problem. 18. On May 9th, the New York Times reported that Mr. Giuliani was planning to travel to Ukraine to urge President Zelensky to pursue the investigations. Mr. Giuliani acknowledged that somebody could say it's improper to pressure Ukraine to open investigations that would benefit President Trump, but he argued, "This isn't foreign policy. I am asking them to do an investigation that they're already doing and that other people are telling them to stop. And I'm going to give them reasons why they shouldn't stop it because that information will be very, very helpful to my client and may turn out to be helpful to my government." Ukraine was not, in fact, already conducting these investigations. As described below, the Trump administration repeatedly tried but failed to get Ukrainian officials to investigate these investigations. Accordingly to Mr. Giuliani, the president supported his actions, stating that President Trump basically knows what I am doing, sure, as his lawyer. 19. In a letter dated May 10th, 2019, and addressed to President-elect Zelensky, Mr. Giuliani wrote that he represented him, President Trump, as a private citizen, not as President of the United States. In his capacity as personal counsel to President Trump, and with his knowledge and consent, Mr. Giuliani requested a meeting with President Zelensky the following week to discuss a specific request. 20. On the evening of May 10th, Friday, however, Mr. Giuliani announced that he was canceling his trip. He later explained, "I am not going to Ukraine because I'm walking into a group of people that are enemies of the president." 21. By the following Monday morning, May 13th, President Trump had ordered Vice President Pence not to attend President Zelensky's inauguration in favor of a lower-ranking delegation led by Secretary of Energy Rick Perry. 22. The U.S. delegation, which also included Ambassador to European Union Gordon Sondland, Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations, Ambassador Kurt Volker, and NSC Director for Ukraine, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, returned from the inauguration convinced that President Zelensky was genuinely committed to anti-corruption reforms. 23. At a meeting in the Oval Office on May 23rd, members of the delegation relayed their positive impressions to President Trump and encouraged him to schedule the promised Oval Office meeting for President Zelensky. President Trump, however, said he didn't believe the delegation's positive assessment, claiming, "That's not what I hear from Mr. Giuliani." The president cast his dim view of Ukraine in personal terms, stating that Ukraine tried to take me down during the 2016 election, an apparent reference to the debunked conspiracy theory that Ukraine interfered in the 2016 election to help Hillary Clinton and harm his campaign. 24. Rather than commit to a date for an Oval Office meeting with President Zelensky, President Trump directed the delegation to talk to Rudy. Talk to Rudy! Ambassador Sondland testified that if the delegation never called Rudy and just left it alone, nothing would happen with Ukraine. And if the president was going to have his mind changed, that was the path. Following the May 23rd meeting, Secretary Perry and Ambassador Sondland and Volker began to coordinate and work with Mr. Giuliani to satisfy the president's demands. 25. Mr. Giuliani is not a U.S. government official and has never served in the Trump administration. Rather, he has repeatedly made clear that his goal was to obtain information that will be very, very helpful to my client, President Trump. Mr. Giuliani made clear to Ambassador Sondland and Volker, who were in direct communication with Ukrainian officials, that a White House meeting would not occur until Ukraine announced its pursuit of 2 political investigations. 26. On June 17th, Ambassador Bill Taylor, whom Secretary of State Mike Pompeo had asked to replace Ambassador Yovanovitch, arrived in Kiev as the new charge d'affaires. 27. Ambassador Taylor quickly observed that there was an irregular channel led by Mr. Giuliani that over time began to undermine the official channel of U.S. diplomatic relations with Ukraine. Ambassador Sondland similarly testified that the agenda described by Mr. Giuliani became more insidious over time. Mr. Giuliani would prove to be, as the President National Security Advisor Ambassador John Bolton told a colleague, a hand grenade that was going to blow everyone up. C. The President froze vital and other security assistance for Ukraine. 28. Since 2014, Ukraine has been engaged in an ongoing armed conflict with Russia in the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. Ukraine is a strategic partner of the United States, and the United States has long supported Ukraine in its conflict with Russia. As Ambassador Volker and multiple other witnesses testified, supporting Ukraine is critically important to U.S. interest, including countering Russian aggression in the region. 29. Ukrainians face casualties on a near-daily basis in their ongoing conflict with Russia. Since 2014, Russian aggression has resulted in more than 13,000 Ukrainian deaths on Ukrainian territory, including approximately 3,331 civilians, and has wounded another 30,000 persons. 30. Since 2014, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and its annexation of the Crimean Peninsula, Congress has allocated military and other security assistance funds to Ukraine on a broad bipartisan basis. Since 2014, the United States has provided approximately $3.1 billion in foreign assistance to Ukraine, $1.5 billion in military and other assistance, and $1.6 billion in non-military, non-humanitarian aid to Ukraine. 31. The military assistance provided by the United States to Ukraine saves lives by making Ukrainian resistance to Russia more effective. It is likewise advances U.S. national security interest, because if Russia prevails and Ukraine falls to Russian dominion, we can expect to see other attempts by Russia to expand its territory and influence. Indeed, the reason the United States provides assistance to the Ukrainian military is so that they can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight over here. 32. The United States' European allies have similarly provided political and economic support to Ukraine. Since 2014, the European Union, EU, has been the largest donor to Ukraine. The EU has extended more macro-financial assistance to Ukraine, approximately 3.3 billion euros, than any other non-EU country, and has committed to extend another 1.1 billion euros. Between 2014 and September 30th, 2019, the EU and the European financial institutions, including the European Investment Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and others, committed over 15 billion euros in grants and loans to support reform process in Ukraine. According to EU data, Germany contributed 786.5 million euros to Ukraine between 2015 and 2017. The United Kingdom contributed 105.6 million, and France contributed 61.9 million EU over that same time period, not including the amounts these countries contribute through the EU. 33. In 2017 and 2018, the United States provided approximately $511 and $359 million, respectively, in foreign assistance to Ukraine, including military and other security assistance. During those 2 years, President Trump and his administration allowed the funds to flow to Ukraine unimpeded. 34. For fiscal year 2019, Congress appropriated and authorized $391 million in taxpayer-funded security assistance to Ukraine, $250 million in funds administered by the Department of Defense, and $115 million in funds administered by the State Department, with another $26 million carried over from fiscal year 2018. 35. DoD planned to use the funds to provide Ukraine with sniper rifles, rocket-propelled grenade launchers, counter-artillery radars, electronic warfare detection, and secure communications and night vision equipment, among other military equipment, to defend itself against Russian forces, which have occupied part of eastern Ukraine since 2014. These purposes were consistent with the goals of Congress, which had appropriated the funds administered by the DoD under the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, USAI, for the purpose of providing training, equipment, lethal assistance, logistics support, supply and services, sustainment, and intelligence support to the military and national security forces of Ukraine, and replacement of any weapons or articles provided to the government of Ukraine. 36. On June 18, 2019, after all congressionally mandated conditions on the DoD administered aid, including certification that Ukraine had adopted sufficient anti-corruption reforms were met, DoD issued a press release announcing its intention to provide the $250 million in security assistance to Ukraine. 37. On June 19th, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, received questions from President Trump about the funding for Ukraine. OMB, in turn, made inquiries with DoD. 38. On June 27th, Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney reportedly emailed his senior advisor, Robert Blair, "Did we ever find out about the money for Ukraine and whether we can hold it back?" Mr. Blair responded that it would be possible, but they should expect Congress to become unhinged if the president held back appropriated funds. 39. Around this time, despite overwhelming support for the security assistance from every relevant executive branch agency, and despite the fact that the funds had been authorized and appropriated by Congress with strong bipartisan support, the president ordered a hold on all military and other assistance to Ukraine. 40. By July 3rd, OMB had blocked the release of $141 million in State Department funds. By July 12th, all military and other assistance for Ukraine had been blocked. 41. On July 18th, OMB announced to the relevant executive branch agencies during a secure video conference that President Trump had ordered a hold on all Ukraine security assistance. No explanation for the hold was provided. 42. On July 25th, approximately 90 minutes after President Trump spoke by phone with President Zelensky, OMB's Associate Director for National Security Programs, Michael Duffy, a political appointee, instructed DoD officials, based on guidance I have received and in light of the administrative plan to review assistance to Ukraine, including Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, please hold off on any additional DoD obligations of these funds, pending direction from that process. He added, "Given the sensitive nature of the request, I appreciate your keeping that information closely held to those who need to know to execute the direction." 43. In late July, the NSC convened a series of intra-agency meetings during which senior executive branch officials discussed the hold on security assistance. Over the course of these meetings, a number of facts became clear. The president personally directed the hold through OMB. 2. No credible justification was provided for the hold. 3. With the exception of OMB, all relevant agencies supported the Ukraine security assistance because, among other things, it was in the national security interest of the United States, and there were serious concerns about the legality of the hold. 44. Although President Trump later claimed that the hold was part of an effort to get European allies to share more of the cost for security assistance for Ukraine, officials responsible for the security assistance testified they had not heard that rationale discussed in June, July, or August. For example, Mark Sandy, OMB's Deputy Associate Director for National Security Programs, who is responsible for DoD's portion of the Ukraine security assistance, testified that the European burden-sharing explanation was first provided to him in September, following his repeated request to learn the reason for the hold. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense Laura Cooper, whose responsibility included the Ukraine security assistance, testified she had no recollection of the issue of Allied burden sharing coming up in the 3 meetings she attended about the freeze on security assistance, nor did she recall hearing about a lack of funding from Ukraine's allies as a reason for the freeze. Ms. Cooper further testified there was no policy or intra-agency review process relating to the Ukraine security assistance that she participated in or knew of in August of 2019. In addition, while the aid was being withheld, Ambassador Sondland, the U.S. ambassador to the EU, was never asked to reach out to the EU or its member states to ask them to increase their contributions to Ukraine. 45. 2 OMB career officials, including one of its legal counsel, ultimately resigned in part over concerns about the handling of the hold on security assistance. A confidential White House review has reportedly turned up hundreds of documents that reveal extensive efforts to generate an after-the-fact justification for the hold. 46. Throughout August, officials from the DoD warned officials from OMB that, as the hold continued, there was an increasing risk that the funds for Ukraine would not be timely obligated, in violation of the Impound Control Act of 1974. On January 16, 2020, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, GAO, concluded that OMB had in fact violated the Impound Control Act when it withheld from obligation funds appropriated by Congress to DoD for security assistance to Ukraine. GAO stated that faithful execution of the law does not permit the president to substitute his own policy priorities for those that Congress had enacted into law. 47. In late August, Secretary of Defense Mike Esper, Secretary of State Pompeo, and National Security Advisor Bolton reportedly urged President to release aid to Ukraine, advising the President that the aid was in America's national security interest. On August 30, however, an OMB official advised the Pentagon official by email that there was clear direction from POTUS to continue the hold. 48. Contrary to U.S. national security interest, and over the objections of his own advisor, President Trump continued to withhold the funding to Ukraine through August and into September without any credible explanation. D. President Trump conditioned a White House meeting on Ukraine announcing it would launch politically motivated investigations. Upon his arrival in Kiev in June 2019, Ambassador Taylor sought to schedule the promised White House meeting for President Zelensky, which was an agreed-upon goal of policymakers in Ukraine and the United States. 50. As Ambassador Volker explained, a White House visit by President Zelensky would constitute a tremendous symbol of support for Ukraine and would enhance President Zelensky's stature. 51. Ambassador Taylor learned, however, that President Trump wanted to hear from Zelensky, who had to make clear to President Trump that he was not standing in the way of investigations. It soon became clear to Ambassador Taylor and others that the White House meeting would not be scheduled until Ukraine committed to the investigations of Burisma and alleged Ukrainian influence into the 2016 elections. 52. Ambassador Sondland was unequivocal in describing his conditionality. He testified, I know that members of this committee frequently frame these complicated issues in the form of a simple question. Was there a quid pro quo? As I testified, with regard to the White House call and the White House meeting, the answer is yes. 53. According to Ambassador Sondland, the public announcement of the investigations, and not necessarily the pursuit of the investigations themselves, was the price President Trump sought in exchange for a White House meeting with Ukrainian President Zelensky. 54. Both Ambassadors Volker and Sondland explicitly communicated this quid pro quo to Ukrainian government officials. For example, on July 2nd, in Toronto, Canada, Ambassador Volker conveyed the message directly to President Zelensky and referred to the Giuliani factor in President Zelensky's engagement with the United States. Ambassador Volker told Ambassador Taylor during the Toronto conference, he counseled President Zelensky about he could prepare for the phone call with President Trump, specifically that President Trump would like to hear about the investigations. 55. Ambassador Volker confirmed that in a pull-aside meeting in Toronto, he advised President Zelensky he should call President Trump personally because he needed to be able to convey to President Trump that he was serious about fighting corruption and investigating things that happened in the past and so forth. Upon hearing about this discussion, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs, George Kent, told Ambassador Volker that asking for another country to investigate a prosecution for political reasons undermines our advocacy of the rule of law. 56. On July 10th, at a meeting with Ukrainian officials in Ambassador Bolton's office at the White House, Ambassador Sondland was even more explicit about the quid pro quo. He stated in front of multiple witnesses, including two top advisors to President Zelensky and Ambassador Bolton, that he had an arrangement with Mr. Mulvaney to schedule the White House visit after Ukraine initiated the investigations. 57. In a second meeting in the White House wardroom shortly thereafter, Ambassador Sondland, in front of the Ukrainians, was talking about how he had an agreement with Chief of Staff Mulvaney for a meeting with the Ukrainians if they were going to go forward with the investigations. More specifically, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman testified that Ambassador Sondland said the Ukrainians would have to deliver an investigation into the Bidens. 58. During that meeting, Dr. Hill and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman objected to Ambassador Sondland intertwining what Dr. Hill later described as a domestic political errand with official national security policy towards Ukraine. 59. Following the July 10 meetings, Dr. Hill discussed what had occurred with Ambassador Bolton, including Ambassador Sondland's reiteration of the quid pro quo to the Ukrainians in the wardroom. Ambassador Bolton told her to go and tell the NSC legal advisor that I am not part of whatever drug deal Sondland and Mulvaney are cooking up on this. 60. Both Dr. Hill and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman separately reported Sondland's description of the quid pro quo during the July 10th meetings to NSC legal advisor John Eisenberg, who said he would follow up. 61. After the July 10th meetings, Andrei Yermak, a top aide to President Zelensky, who was in the meetings, followed up with Ambassador Volker by text message, "Thank you for meeting and your clear and very logical position. I feel that the key for many things is Rudy, and I am ready to talk with him at any time." 62. Over the next 2 weeks, Ambassador Sondland and Volker continued with Mr. Giuliani and senior Ukrainian and American officials to arrange a telephone call between President Trump and President Zelensky. They also worked to ensure that, during that phone call, President Zelensky would convince President Trump of his willingness to undertake the investigations in order to get the White House meeting scheduled. 63. On July 19th, Ambassador Volker had breakfast with Mr. Giuliani at the Trump Hotel in Washington, D.C. After that meeting, Ambassador Volker reported back to Ambassador Sondland and Taylor about his conversation with Mr. Giuliani, stating, "Most important for Zelensky to say that he will help investigation and address any specific personal issues if there are any." 64. The same day, Ambassador Sondland spoke with President Zelensky and recommended that the Ukrainian leader tell President Trump that he will leave no stone unturned regarding the investigations during the upcoming presidential phone call. 65. Following his conversations with President Zelensky, Ambassador Sondland emailed top Trump officials, including Secretary Pompeo, Mr. Mulvaney, and Secretary Perry. Ambassador Sondland stated that President Zelensky confirmed that he would assure President Trump that he intends to run a fully transparent investigation and will turn over every stone. 66. Secretary Perry responded to Ambassador Sondland's email. "Mick just confirmed the call being set up for tomorrow by NSC." About an hour later, Mr. Mulvaney replied, "I asked the NSC to set it up for tomorrow." 67. According to Ambassador Sondland, this email and other correspondence with top Trump administration officials showed that his efforts regarding Ukraine were not part of a rogue foreign policy. To the contrary, Ambassador Sondland testified that everyone was in the loop. 68. The Ukrainians also understood the quid pro quo and the domestic U.S. political ramifications of the investigations they were being asked to pursue. On July 20th, a close advisor to President Zelensky warned Ambassador Taylor that the Ukrainian leader did not want to be used as a pawn in a U.S. reelection campaign. The next day, Ambassador Taylor warned Ambassador Sondland that President Zelensky was sensitive about Ukraine being taken seriously, not merely as an instrument in Washington domestic reelection politics. 69. Nevertheless, President Trump directly and through his hand-picked representatives continued to press the Ukrainian government for the announcement of investigations, including during President Trump's July 25th call with President Zelensky. E. President Trump directly solicited election interference from President Zelensky. 70. In the days leading up to President Trump's July 25th call with President Zelensky, U.S. polling data showed former Vice President leading in a head-to-head contest against President Trump. 71. Meanwhile, Ambassador Sondland and Volker continued to prepare President Zelensky and his advisors for the call with President Trump until right before it occurred. 72. On the morning of July 25th, Ambassador Sondland spoke with President Trump in advance of his call with President Zelensky. Ambassador Sondland then called Ambassador Volker and left a voicemail. 73. After receiving Ambassador Sondland's message, Ambassador Volker sent a text message to President Zelensky's aide, Mr. Yermak, approximately 30 minutes before the call. Heard from the White House, assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down date for visit to Washington. Good luck. 74. In his public testimony, Ambassador Sondland confirmed that Ambassador Volker's text message to Mr. Yermak accurately summarized the directive he had received from President Trump early that morning. 75. During the roughly 30-minute July 25th call, President Zelensky thanked President Trump for the great support in the area of defense provided by the United States and stated that Ukraine would soon be prepared to purchase additional Javelin anti-tank missiles from the United States. 76. President Trump immediately responded with his own request. I would like you to do us a favor, though, which was to find out what happened with alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election and look into former Vice President Biden's role in encouraging the removal of the former Ukrainian Prosecutor General. 77. Referencing Special Counsel Mueller's investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 election, President Trump told President Zelensky, they say a lot of it started with Ukraine, and whatever you can do, it's very important that you do it if that's possible. 78. President Trump repeatedly pressed the Ukrainian president to consult with his personal lawyer, Mr. Giuliani, as well as Attorney General William Barr, about two specific investigations. President Trump stated, Rudy very much knows what's happening, and he is a very capable guy. If you could speak to him, that would be great. 79. President Zelensky agreed, referencing Mr. Giuliani's back-channel role, noting that Mr. Yermak spoke with Mr. Giuliani just recently. We are hoping very much that Mr. Giuliani will be able to travel to Ukraine, and we will meet once he comes to Ukraine. 80. Later in the call, President Zelensky heeded the directive he had received from Ambassador Sondland and Volker, and he thanked President Trump for his invitation to the White House and reiterated that, on the other hand, he would ensure that Ukraine pursued the investigations that President Trump had requested. President Zelensky confirmed the investigations should be done openly. 81. During the call, President Trump also attacked Ambassador Yovanovitch. He said the former ambassador from the United States, the woman, was bad news, and the people she was dealing with in the Ukraine were bad news. So I just want to let you know that. He later added, well, she's going to go through some things. President Trump also defended then Ukrainian Prosecutor General Yuri Lutsenko, who was widely known to be corrupt. 82. The president did not mention any other issues relating to Ukraine, including concerns about Ukrainian corruption, President Zelensky's anti-corruption reforms, or the ongoing war with Russia. The president only identified two people in reference to investigations, Vice President Biden and his son. 83. Listening to the call as it transpired, several White House staff members became alarmed. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman immediately reported his concerns to NSC lawyers because, as he testified, it is improper for the President of the United States to demand a foreign government investigate a U.S. citizen or a political opponent. 84. Jennifer Williams, an advisor to Vice President Pence, testified that the call struck her as unusual and inappropriate, and the references to specific individuals and investigations such as former Vice President Biden and his son struck me as political in nature. She believed Trump's solicitation of the investigation was inappropriate because it appeared to be a domestic political matter. 85. Timothy Morrison, Dr. Hill's successor at the NSC's Senior Director for Europe and Russia and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman's supervisor, said the call was not the full-throated endorsement of the Ukraine reform agenda that I was hoping to hear. He, too, reported the call to the NSC lawyers, worrying that the call would be damaging if leaked publicly. 86. In response, Mr. Eisenberg and his deputy, Michael Ellis, tightly restricted access to the call summary, which was placed on a highly classified NSC server, even though it did not contain any highly classified information. 87. On July 26, the day after the call, Ambassador Sondland had lunch with State Department aides in Kiev, including David Holmes, the counselor for political affairs at the U.S. Embassy in Kiev. During the lunch, Ambassador Sondland called President Trump directly from his cell phone. President Trump asked Ambassador Sondland whether President Zelensky was going to do the investigations. Ambassador Sondland stated that President Zelensky was going to do it, and he would do anything you asked him to. 88. After the call, it was clear to Ambassador Sondland that a public statement from President Zelensky committing to the investigations was a prerequisite for the White House meeting. He told Mr. Holmes that President Trump did not give an expletive about Ukraine. Rather, the president cared only about big stuff that benefited him personally, like the Biden investigation that Mr. Giuliani was pushing, and that President Trump had directly solicited during the July 25th call. F. President Trump conditioned the release of security assistance for Ukraine and continued to leverage a White House meeting to pressure Ukraine to launch politically motivated investigations. 89. As discussed further below, following the July 25th call, President Trump's representatives, including Ambassadors Sondland and Volker, in coordination with Mr. Giuliani, pressed the Ukrainians to issue a public statement announcing the investigations. At the same time, officials in both the United States and Ukraine became increasingly concerned about President Trump's continuing hold on security assistance. 90. The Ukrainian government was aware of the hold by at least late July, around the time of President Trump's July 25th call with President Zelensky. On the day of the call itself, DoD officials learned that diplomats in the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, D.C. had made multiple overtures to DoD and the State Department asking about security assistance. 91. Around this time, two different officials at the Ukrainian embassy approached Ambassador Volker's special advisor to ask her about the hold. 92. By mid-August, before the hold was public, Lieutenant Colonel Vindman also received inquiries from the Ukrainian embassy. Lieutenant Colonel Vindman testified that during this time frame, it was no secret, at least within the government and official channels, that security assistance was on hold. 93. The former Ukrainian Deputy Foreign Minister Olena Zerkal had acknowledged that she became aware of the hold on security assistance no later than July 30th based on a diplomatic cable transmitted the previous week from Ukrainian officials in Washington, D.C. She said that President Zelensky's office had received a copy of the cable simultaneously. Ms. Zerkal further stated that President Zelensky's top advisor, Andriy Yermak, told her to keep silent, to not comment without permission, and about the hold or about the Ukrainian government became aware of it. 94. In early August, Ambassadors Sondland and Volker, in coordination with Mr. Giuliani, endeavored to pressure President Zelensky to make a public statement announcing the investigations. On August 10th, in a text message that showed the Ukrainians' understanding of the quid pro quo, President Zelensky's advisor, Mr. Yermak, told Ambassador Volker that once a date was set for a White House meeting, he would call for a press briefing announcing upcoming visit and outlining vision for the reboot of the U.S.-Ukraine relationship, including, among other things, Burisma and election meddling in investigations. 95. On August 11th, Ambassador Sondland emailed two State Department officials, of whom acted as a direct line to Secretary Pompeo, to inform them about the agreement for President Zelensky to issue a statement that would include an announcement of the two investigations. Ambassador Sondland stated that he expected a draft of the statement to be delivered for our review in a day or two and hoped that the statement would make the boss, i.e. President Trump, happy enough to authorize an invitation for a White House meeting. 96. On August 12th, Mr. Yermak texted Ambassador Volker an initial draft of the statement. The draft referred to the problem of interference in the political processes of the United States, but did not explicitly mention the two investigations that President Trump requested in the July 25th call. 97. The next day, Ambassadors Volker and Sondland discussed the draft statement with Mr. Giuliani, who told them if the statement doesn't say Burisma and 2016, it's not credible. As Ambassador Sondland would later testify, Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew these investigations were important to the President. 98. Ambassadors Volker and Sondland relayed this message to Mr. Yermak and sent him a revised statement that included explicit references to Burisma and the 2016 elections. 99. In light of President Zelensky's anti-corruption agenda, Ukrainian officials resisted issuing the statement in August, and as a result, there was no movement towards scheduling a White House meeting. 100. Meanwhile, there was growing concern about President Trump's continued hold on the security assistance for Ukraine. The hold remained in place through August against the unanimous judgment of American national security officials charged with overseeing U.S.-Ukraine policy. For example, during a high-level intra-agency meeting in late July, officials unanimously advocated for releasing the hold, with the exception of OMB, which was acting under guidance from the President and Acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney to freeze the assistance. But even officials within OMB had internally recommended that the hold be removed because assistance to Ukraine is consistent with U.S. national strategy, provides the benefit of opposing Russian aggression, and is backed by bipartisan support. 101. Without an explanation for the hold, and with President Trump already conditioning a White House visit on the announcement of the investigations, it became increasingly apparent to multiple witnesses that the security assistance was being withheld in order to pressure Ukraine to announce the investigations. As Ambassador Sondland testified, President Trump's effort to condition release of the security assistance on the announcement of the investigations was a clear 2 + 2 = 4. 102. On August 22nd, Ambassador Sondland emailed Secretary Pompeo in an effort to break the logjam on the security assistance and the White House meeting. He proposed that President Trump should arrange to speak to President Zelensky during an upcoming trip to Warsaw, during which President Zelensky could look President Trump in the eye and tell him he was prepared to move forward publicly on the issues of importance to POTUS and to the U.S., i.e., announce the 2 investigations. 103. On August 28, news of the hold was publicly reported by Politico. 104. As soon as the hold became public, Ukrainian officials expressed significant concern to U.S. officials. They were deeply worried not only about the practical impact that the hold would have on efforts to fight Russian aggression, but also about the symbolic message the now publicized lack of support from the Trump administration sent to the Russian government, which would almost certainly seek to exploit any real or perceived crack in U.S. resolve toward Ukraine. Mr. Yermak and other Ukrainian officials told Ambassador Taylor that they were desperate and would be willing to travel to Washington to raise with U.S. officials the importance of the assistance. The recently appointed Ukrainian Prosecutor General later remarked, "It is critically important for the West not to pull us into some conflicts between their ruling elites." 105. On September 1st, within days of President Trump rejecting the request from Secretary Pompeo and Esper and Ambassador Bolton to release the hold, Vice President Trump met with President Zelensky in Warsaw, Poland, after President Trump canceled his trip. 106. In advance of this meeting, Ambassador Sondland told Vice President Pence that he had concerns that the delay in aid had become tied to the issue of investigations. Sondland testified that Vice President Pence nodded like, he heard what I said, and that was pretty much it. 107. During the meeting that followed, which Ambassador Sondland also attended, the very first question that President Zelensky asked President Pence related to the status of the U.S. security assistance. President Zelensky emphasized the symbolic value of U.S. support in terms of security assistance. was just as valuable to the Ukrainians as the actual dollars. He also voiced concern that any hold or appearance of reconsideration of such assistance might embolden Russia to think that the United States was no longer committed to Ukraine. 108. Vice President Pence told President Zelensky that he would speak to President Trump that evening. Although Vice President Pence did speak with President Trump, the president still did not lift the hold. 109. Following the meeting between Vice President Pence and President Zelensky, Ambassador Sondland pulled aside President Zelensky's advisor, Mr. Yermak, to explain that the resumption of U.S. aid would likely not occur until Ukraine took some kind of action and issuing a public statement about the investigations. 110. Immediately following that conversation, Ambassador Sondland walked over to Mr. Morrison, who had been standing across the room observing their interactions. Ambassador Sondland told Mr. Morrison that what he had communicated to Mr. Yermak was that what could help Ukraine move the aid was if the Prosecutor General would go to the mic and announce he was opening the investigations. 111. Later that day, Mr. Morrison reported this conversation to Ambassador Bolton, who advised him stay out of it and brief the NSC lawyers. Mr. Morrison subsequently reported the conversation to Mr. Eisenberg. 112. Mr. Morrison also informed Ambassador Taylor about his conversation with Ambassador Sondland. Ambassador Taylor was alarmed by what Mr. Morrison told him about the Sondland-Yermak conversation. He followed up by texting Ambassador Sondland, "Are we now saying that security assistance and White House meeting are conditioned on investigation?" Ambassador Sondland responded, "Call me." 113. Ambassador Sondland and Taylor then spoke by telephone. Ambassador Sondland again relayed what he told Mr. Yermak and explained that he had made a mistake in telling Ukrainian officials that only the White House meeting was conditioned on a public announcement of investigations. He clarified that everything, the White House meeting and security assistance for Ukraine, was conditioned on the announcement of investigations. Ambassador Sondland explained to Ambassador Taylor that President Trump wanted President Zelensky in a public box by making a public statement about ordering such investigations. 114. On September 7th, President Trump and Ambassador Sondland spoke by telephone. As Ambassador Sondland relayed later that day during a call with Mr. Morrison, President Trump told him there was no quid pro quo, but President Zelensky must announce the opening of the investigation, and he should want to do it. 115. Mr. Morrison conveyed the substance of the September 11th call between President Trump and Ambassador Sondland to Ambassador Taylor. Mr. Morrison said that the call had given him a sinking feeling because he feared the security assistance would not be released before September 30th, the end of the fiscal year, and because he did not think it was a good idea for the Ukrainian president to involve himself in our politics. At Ambassador Bolton's direction, Mr. Morrison reported Ambassador Sondland's description of the president's statements to the NSC lawyers. 116. The next day, September 8th, Ambassador Sondland confirmed in a phone call with Ambassador Taylor that he had spoken to President Trump and that President Trump was adamant that President Zelensky himself had to announce the investigations publicly. 117. Ambassador Sondland also told Ambassador Taylor that he had passed President Trump's message directly to President Zelensky, and Mr. Yermak had told them that although this was not a quid pro quo, if President Zelensky did not clear things up in public, we would be at a stalemate, meaning Ukraine would not receive the much-needed military assistance. 118. Early the next morning on September 9th, Ambassador Taylor texted Ambassador Sondland and Volker. As I said on the phone, I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign. 119. The Ukrainians succumbed to the pressure. In early September, President Zelensky agreed to do a televised interview, during which he would publicly announce the investigations. The Ukrainians made arrangements for the interview to occur on CNN later in September. 120. The White House subsequently confirmed that the release of security assistance had been conditioned on Ukraine's announcement of the investigations. During a White House press conference on October 17th, Acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney acknowledged that he had discussed security assistance with the President and that the President's decision to withhold it was directly tied to his desire that Ukraine investigate alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 U.S. election. 121. After a reporter attempted to clarify this explicit acknowledgement of a quid pro quo, Mr. Mulvaney replied, "We do that all the time with foreign policy," he added. "I have news for everybody. Get over it. There is going to be political influence in foreign policy." 122. Multiple foreign policy and national security officials testified that the pursuit of investigations into the Bidens and alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election was not part of official U.S. policy. Instead, Dr. Hill described these investigations were part of a domestic political errand of President Trump. Mr. Kent further explained that urging Ukraine to engage in selective politically associated investigations or prosecutions undermines our long-standing efforts to promote the rule of law abroad. 123. Ambassador Volker, in response to an inquiry from President Zelensky's advisor, Mr. Yermak, confirmed that the United States Department of Justice, DOJ, did not make an official request for Ukraine's assistance in these investigations. 124. Within hours after the White House publicly released a record of the July 25th call, DOJ itself confirmed in a statement that no such request was ever made. The President has not spoken with the Attorney General about having Ukraine investigate anything related to former Vice President Biden or his son. The President has not asked the Attorney General to contact Ukraine on this or any other matter. The Attorney General has not communicated with Ukraine on this or any other subject. G. President Trump was forced to lift the hold but continued to solicit foreign interference in the upcoming election. 125. As noted above, by early September 2019, President Zelensky had signaled his willingness to announce the two investigations to secure a White House meeting and the security assistance. He was scheduled to make the announcement during a CNN interview later in September, but other events intervened. On 126. On September 9th, the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, the Committee on Oversight and Reform, and the Committee on Foreign Affairs announced a joint investigation into the scheme by President Trump to improperly pressure the Ukrainian government to assist the president's bid for re-election. The same day, the committee sent document production and preservation requests to the White House and the State Department. 127. NSC staff members believe that the congressional investigation might have the effect of releasing the hold on Ukraine military assistance because it would have potentially politically challenging to justify the hold. 128. Later that day, the Inspector General of the Intelligence Community, ICIG, wrote to the chairman and ranking member of the Intelligence Committee notifying them that a whistleblower had filed a complaint on August 12th and that the ICIG had determined to be both an urgent concern and credible. The ICIG did not disclose the contents of the complaint. 129. The ICIG further stated that the Acting Director of National Intelligence, DNI, had taken the unprecedented step of withholding the whistleblower complaint from Congress. It was later revealed that the acting DNI had done so as a result of communications with the White House and the Department of Justice. The next day, September 10th, Chairman Schiff wrote to acting DNI Joseph McGuire to express his concerns about acting DNI's unprecedented departure from past practice in withholding the whistleblower complaint and observed that failure to transmit to the committee an urgent and credible whistleblower complaint as required by law raises the prospect that an urgent matter of serious nature is being purposely concealed from the committee. 130. The White House was aware of the contents of the whistleblower complaint since at least August 26th, when the acting DNI informed the White House counsel of the complaint. White House counsel Pat Cipollone and Mr. Eisenberg reportedly briefed President Trump on the whistleblower complaint in late August and discussed whether they had to give it to Congress. 131. On September 11th, 2 days after the ICIG notified Congress of the whistleblower complaint and the three House's committees announced their investigation, President Trump lifted the hold on security assistance. As with the implementation of the hold, no credible reason was provided for lifting the hold. At the time of the release, there was no discernible changes in international assistance commitments for Ukraine or Ukrainian anti-corruption reforms. 132. Because of the hold the President placed on security assistance for Ukraine, DoD was unable to spend approximately $35 million or 14% of the funds appropriated by Congress for fiscal 2019. 133. Congress was forced to pass a new law to extend the funding in order to ensure the full amount could be used by Ukraine to defend itself. Still, by early 2019, Ukraine had not received approximately $20 million of military assistance. 134. Although the hold was lifted, the White House still had not announced the date for President Zelensky's meeting with President Trump. And there were indications that President Zelensky's interview with CNN would still occur. 135. On September 18th, a week before President Trump was scheduled to meet with President Zelensky on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in New York, Vice President Pence had a call with President Zelensky. During the call, Vice President Pence asked a bit more about how Zelensky's efforts were going. Additional details about this call were provided to the House by Vice President Pence's advisor, Jennifer Williams, but were classified by the Office of the Vice President. Despite repeated requests, the Vice President has refused to declassify Ms. Williams' supplemental testimony. 136. On September 18th or 19th, at the urging of Ambassador Taylor, President Zelensky canceled the CNN interview. 137. To date, almost 9 months after the initial invitation was extended to President Trump on April 21st, a White House meeting for President Zelensky has not occurred. Since the initial invitation, President Trump has met with more than a dozen world leaders at the White House, including a meeting in the Oval Office with the Foreign Minister of Russia on December 10th. 138. Since lifting the hold, and even after the House impeachment inquiry was announced on September 24th, President Trump has continued to press Ukraine to investigate Vice President Biden and alleged 2016 election interference by Ukraine. 139. On September 24th, in remarks at the opening session of the UN General Assembly, President Trump stated, "What Joe Biden did for his something, that's something they, Ukraine, should be looking at." 140. On September 25th, in a joint public press availability with President Zelensky, President Trump stated, "I want him to do whatever he can in reference to the investigation of the Bidens." That same day, Trump denied that his pursuit of the investigation involved a quid pro quo. 141. On September 30th, during remarks at the swearing-in of a new Labor Secretary, President Trump stated, "Now, the new president of Ukraine ran on a basis of no corruption. But there was a lot of corruption having to do with the 2016 election and us, and we want to get to the bottom of it. And it's very important that we do." On 142. On October 3rd, when asked by a reporter what he had hoped President Zelensky would do following their July 25th call, President Trump responded, "Well, I would think that, if they were honest about it, they'd start a major investigation into the Bidens. It's a very simple answer." The president also suggested that China should start an investigation into the Bidens because what happened in China is just about as bad as what happened with Ukraine. 143. On October 4, President Trump equated his interest in looking for corruption to the investigation of two particular subjects: the Bidens and Ukrainian interference in the 2000 election. He told reporters, "What I want to do, and I think I have an obligation to do it, probably a duty to do it, corruption. We're looking for corruption. When you look at what Biden and his son did, and when you look at the other people, what they've done, and I believe there was tremendous corruption with Biden, but I think there was beyond corruption having to do with the 2016 campaign. And what these lowlifes did to so many people, to hurt so many people in the Trump campaign, which was successful despite all of the fighting us, despite all of the unfairness." When asked by a reporter, is someone advising you that it's okay to solicit the help of other governments to investigate a potential political opponent? Trump replied that, here's what's okay. If we feel there's corruption, like I feel there was in the 2016 campaign, there was tremendous corruption against me. If we feel there's corruption, we have a right to go to a foreign country. 144. As the House impeachment inquiry unfolded, Mr. Giuliani, on behalf of the president, also continued to urge Ukraine to pursue the investigations and dig up dirt on former Vice President Biden. Mr. Giuliani's own statements about these efforts further confirm that he has been working in furtherance of the president's personal and political interest. 145. During the first week of December, Mr. Giuliani traveled to Kiev and Budapest and met with both current and former Ukrainian government officials, including a current Ukrainian member of parliament who attended a KGB school in Moscow and has led calls to investigate Burisma and the Bidens. Mr. Giuliani also met with the corrupt former prosecutor generals Viktor Shokin and Yuri Lysenko, who had been promoted the false allegations underlying the investigations President Trump wanted. Mr. Giuliani told the New York Times that in a meeting with Ukrainian officials, he was acting on behalf of his client, President Trump. Like a good lawyer, I am gathering evidence to defend my client against the false charges being leveled against him. 146. During his trip to Ukraine on December 5th, Mr. Giuliani tweeted, "The conversation about corruption in Ukraine was based on compelling evidence of criminal conduct by then VP Biden. In 2016, that has not been resolved, and until it is, will be a major obstacle to the U.S. assisting Ukraine with its anti-corruption reforms." Not only was Mr. Giuliani perpetuating the false allegations against Vice President Biden, he was reiterating the threat that President Trump had used to pressure President Zelensky to announce the investigations, that U.S. assistance to Ukraine could be in jeopardy until Ukraine investigated Vice President Biden. 147. Mr. Giuliani told the Wall Street Journal that when he returned to New York on December 7th, President Trump called him as his plane was still taxiing down the runway. "What did you get?" he said, Mr. Trump asked. "More than you can imagine," Mr. Giuliani replied. 148. Later that day, President Trump told reporters that he was aware of Mr. Giuliani's efforts in Ukraine and believed that Mr. Giuliani wanted to report the information he gathered to the Attorney General and Congress. 149. On December 17th, Mr. Giuliani confirmed that President Trump had been very supportive of his continuing efforts to dig up dirt on Vice President Biden in Ukraine and that they are on the same page. 150. Such ongoing efforts by President Trump, including through his personal attorney, to solicit an investigation of his political opponent, have undermined U.S. credibility. On September 14th, Ambassador Volker advised Mr. Yermak against the Zelensky administration conducting an investigation into President Zelensky's own former political rival, former Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko. When Ambassador Volker raised concerns about such an investigation, Mr. Yermak retorted, "What, you mean like asking us to investigate Clinton and Biden?" Ambassador Volker answered no response. 151. Mr. Holmes, a career diplomat, highlighted this hypocrisy. While we have advised our Ukrainian counterparts to voice a commitment to following the rule of law and generally investigate credible corruption allegations, U.S. officials were making a demand that President Zelensky personally commit on a cable news channel to a specific investigation of President Trump's political rival. H. President Trump's conduct was consistent with his previous invitations of foreign interference in U.S. elections. 152. President Trump's effort to solicit Ukraine's interference in the 2020 U.S. presidential election to help his own re-election campaign were consistent with his prior solicitation and encouragement of Russia's interference in the 2016 election, when the Trump campaign expected it would benefit electorally from the information stolen and released through Russian efforts. 153. As presidential candidate, Mr. Trump repeatedly sought to benefit from Russia's actions to help his campaign. For example, during a public rally on July 26, 2016, then candidate Trump declared, "Russia, if you are listening, I hope you'll be able to find the 30,000 emails that are missing from opposing candidate Hillary Clinton's personal server." With ours, Russian hackers targeted Clinton's personal office for the first time. 154. Days earlier, WikiLeaks had begun releasing emails and documents that were stolen by Russian military and intelligence service in order to damage the Clinton campaign. WikiLeaks continued releasing stolen documents through October 2016. Then, candidate Trump repeatedly applauded and sought to capitalize on WikiLeaks' release of these stolen documents, even after Russian involvement was heavily reported by the press. Members of the Trump campaign also planned messaging and communication strategies around releases by WikiLeaks. In the last month of the campaign, then candidate Trump publicly referred to emails hacked by Russia and disseminated by WikiLeaks over 150 times, 155. Multiple members of the Trump campaign used additional channels to seek Russia's assistance in obtaining damaging information about Clinton. For example, senior representatives of the Trump campaign, including the campaign's chairman and the president's son, met with a Russian attorney in June 2016 who had offered to provide damaging information about Clinton from the government. A foreign policy advisor to the Trump campaign also met repeatedly with people connected to the Russian government and their associates, one of whom claimed to have dirt on Clinton in the form of thousands of emails. 156. Even after Special Counsel Mueller released his report, President Trump confirmed his willingness to benefit from foreign election interference. When asked during a televised interview during June 19, 2019, whether he would accept damaging information from a foreign government about a political opponent, the president responded, "I think I'd take it." President Trump declared that he sees nothing wrong with listening to a foreign power that offers information detrimental to a political adversary. Asked whether such information should be reported to law enforcement, President Trump retorted, "Give me a break. Life doesn't work that way." Just weeks later, President Trump froze security assistance to Ukraine, and his agents were pushing that country to pursue investigations that would help the president's re-election campaign. 157. In addition, President Trump's request for the investigations on the July 25th call with President Zelensky took place one day after former Special Counsel Mueller testified before the House Judiciary Committee and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence about the findings of his investigation into Russia's interference in the 2016 presidential election and the President Trump's effort to undermine that investigation. During his call with President Zelensky, President Trump derided former Special Counsel Mueller's poor performance in his July 24th testimony and speculated that the whole nonsense started with Ukraine. 2. President Trump's obstruction of Congress. 158. President Trump ordered categorical obstruction of the impeachment inquiry undertaken by the House under Article 1 of the Constitution, which vests the House with the sole power of impeachment. A. The House launched an impeachment inquiry. 159. During the 116th Congress, a number of committees of the House have undertaken investigations into allegations of misconduct by President Trump and his administration, including to determine whether to recommend articles of impeachment. 160. As discussed above, on September 9th, the Intelligence Committee and the Committees on Oversight and Reform and Foreign Affairs announced they would conduct a joint investigation into the president's scheme to pressure Ukraine to announce politically motivated investigations. 161. Given the gravity of the allegations that President Trump was soliciting foreign interference in the upcoming 2020 election, Speaker Nancy P. Pelosi announced on September 24th that the House was moving forward with an official impeachment inquiry. Speaker Pelosi directed the committees to proceed with their investigations under the umbrella of an impeachment inquiry. 162. On October 31st, the House enacted a resolution confirming the committee's authority to conduct the impeachment inquiry and adopting procedures governing the inquiry. 163. The procedures adopted by the House afforded procedural privileges to the president that were equivalent to, or in some instances exceeded, those afforded during prior impeachment inquiries. Transcripts of all witness interviews and depositions were released to the public, and President Trump was offered, but refused, multiple opportunities to have his counsel participate in proceedings before the Judiciary Committee, including by cross-examining witnesses and presenting evidence. B. President Trump ordered categorical obstruction of the House's impeachment inquiry. 164. Even before the House launched its impeachment inquiry into President Trump's misconduct concerning Ukraine, he rejected Congress's Article 1 investigative and oversight authority, proclaiming, "We're fighting all the subpoenas, and I have Article 2, where I have the right to do whatever I want as president." 165. In response to the House impeachment inquiry regarding Ukraine, the executive branch categorically refused to provide any requested documents or information at President Trump's direction. 166. On September 9th, 2019, 3 House committees sent a letter to White House counsel Pat Cipollone requesting 6 categories of documents relevant to the Ukraine investigation. By September 16th, When the House did not respond, the committee sent a follow-up letter on September 24th. 167. Instead of responding directly to the committee, the president publicly declared the impeachment inquiry a disgrace and said that it shouldn't be allowed and there should be a way of stopping it. 168. When the White House still did not respond to the committee's request, committees issued a subpoena compelling the White House to turn over documents. 169. The President's response to the House inquiry sent by Mr. Cipollone on October 8th sought to accomplish the President's goal of stopping the House investigation. Mr. Cipollone wrote on behalf of the President, Donald J. Trump, to notify Congress that President Trump cannot permit his administration to participate in this partisan inquiry under these circumstances. 170. Despite the Constitution placement of the sole power of impeachment in the House, Mr. Cipollone's October 8 letter opined that the House inquiry was constitutionally invalid, lacked any basis, lacked any necessary authorization for a valid impeachment, and was merely labeled as an impeachment inquiry. 171. The letter's rhetoric aligned with the president's public campaign against the impeachment inquiry, which he has branded a coup intended to take away the power of the people, an unconstitutional abuse of power, and an open war on democracy. 172. Although President Trump has categorically sought to obstruct the House's impeachment inquiry, he has never formally asserted a claim of executive privilege as to any document or testimony. Mr. Cipollone's October 8th letter refers to long-established executive branch confidentiality, interest, and privileges. But the president did not actually assert executive privilege. Similarly, a justice official of legal counsel, November 1st, 2019 opinion, only recognized that information responsive to the subpoenas was potentially protected by executive privilege. 173. In addition, the president and his agents have spoken at length about these events to the press and on social media. Since the impeachment inquiry was announced on September 24th, the president has made numerous public statements about his communications with President Zelensky and his decision-making relating to the hold on security assistance. 174. The president's agents have done the same. For example, on October 16th, Secretary Perry gave an interview to the Wall Street Journal. During the interview, Secretary Perry stated that after the May 23rd meeting at which President Trump refused to schedule a White House meeting with President Zelensky, Secretary Perry sought out Rudy Giuliani this spring at President Trump's direction to address Mr. Trump's concern about alleged Ukrainian corruption. During a phone call with Secretary Perry, Mr. Giuliani said, "Look, the president is really concerned that there are people in Ukraine that tried to beat him during his presidential election. He thinks they are corrupt and that there are still people over there engaged that are absolutely corrupt." 175. On October 17th, Acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney acknowledged during a White House press conference that the discussed security assistance with the president and the president's decision to withhold it was directly tied to his desire that Ukraine investigate alleged Ukrainian interference in the 2016 election. 176. On December 3, 2019, the Intelligence Committee transmitted a detailed, nearly 300-page report documenting its findings about this scheme and about related investigations into it to the Judiciary Committee. The Judiciary Committee held public hearings evaluating the constitutional standard for impeachment and the evidence against President Trump, in which the President Counsel was invited to participate but declined, and then reported 2 articles of impeachment to the House. 177. The President maintained his obstructionist position throughout the process, declaring the House's investigation illegitimate in a letter to Nancy Pelosi on December 17, 2019. President Trump further attempted to undermine the House inquiry by dismissing impeachment as illegal, invalid, and unconstitutional, and by intimidating and threatening an anonymous intelligence community whistleblower, as well as patriotic public servants who honored their subpoenas and testified before the House. 178. On December 18, 2019, the House voted to impeach President Trump and adopted 2 articles of impeachment. C. Following President Trump's directive, the executive branch refused to produce requested and subpoenaed documents. 179. Adhering to President Trump's directive, every executive branch agency that received an impeachment inquiry request or subpoena defied it. 180. House committees issued document requests or subpoenas to the White House, the Office of the Vice President, OMB, the Department of State, DOD, and the Department of Energy. 181. In its response, the Office of the Vice President echoed Mr. Cipollone's assertion that the impeachment inquiry was procedurally invalid, while agencies such as OMB and DOD expressly cited the President's directive. 182. The executive branch has refused to produce any documents in response to the committee's valid, legally binding subpoenas, even though witness testimony has revealed that highly relevant records exist. 183. Indeed, by virtue of President Trump's order, not a single document has been produced by the White House, the Office of the Vice President, OMB, the Department of State, DOD, or the Department of Energy in response to 71 specific, individualized requests or demands for records in their possession, custody, or control. These agencies and offices also blocked many current and former officials from producing records to the committees. 184. Certain witnesses, however, defied the President's order and identified the substance of key documents. For example, Lieutenant Colonel Vidman described a presidential decision memo he prepared in August that conveyed the consensus view among foreign policy and national security officials that the hold on aid to Ukraine should be released. Other witnesses identified additional documents that the President and various agencies were withholding from Congress that were directly relevant to the impeachment inquiry. 185. Some responsive documents have been released by the State Department, DOD, and OMB pursuant to judicial orders issued in response to lawsuits filed under the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA, F-O-I-A. Although limited in scope, the heavily redacted these FOIA productions confirmed that the Trump administration is withholding highly pertinent documents from Congress without any legal valid basis. D. President Trump ordered top aides not to testify, even pursuant to subpoena. 186. President Trump directed government witnesses to violate their legal obligations and defy House subpoenas, regardless of their offices or positions. In some instances, the president personally directed that senior aides defy subpoenas on the ground that they are absolutely immune from compelled testimony. Other officials refused to appear as directed by Mr. Cipollone's October 8th letter. Still, others refused to appear because, consistent with the House deposition rules drafted by then-majority Republican, agency counsel was not permitted in depositions. 187. This administration-wide effort to prevent witnesses from providing testimony was coordinated and comprehensive. In total, 12 current and former administrative officials refused to testify as part of the House's impeachment inquiry into the Ukrainian matter, 9 of whom did so in defiance of duly authorized subpoenas. House committees advised such witnesses that their refusal to testify may be used as adverse inference against the president. Nonetheless, despite being instructed by senior political appointees not to cooperate with the House's impeachment inquiry in directives that frequently cited or enclosed copies of Mr. Cipollone's October 8th letter, many current and former officials complied with their legal obligations to appear for testimony. 188. House committees conducted depositions or transcribed interviews of 17 witnesses. All members of the committees, as well as staff from the majority and the minority, were permitted to attend. The majority and the minority were allotted an equal amount of time to question witnesses. 189. In late November 2019, 12 of these witnesses testified in public hearings convened by the Intelligence Committee, including 3 witnesses called by the minority. 190. Unable to silence certain witnesses, President Trump resorted to intimidation tactics to penalize them. He also levied sustained attacks on the anonymous whistleblower. E. President Trump's conduct was consistent with his previous efforts to obstruct investigations into foreign interference in U.S. elections. 191. President Trump's obstruction of the House's impeachment inquiry was consistent with his previous efforts to undermine Special Counsel Mueller III's investigation of Russia's interference in the 2016 election of the president's own misconduct. 192. President Trump repeatedly used his powers of office to undermine and derail the Mueller investigation, particularly after learning that he was personally under investigation for obstruction of justice. Among other things, President Trump ordered White House counsel Don McGahn to fire Special Counsel Mueller, instructed Mr. McGahn to create a record and issue statements falsely denying this event, sought to curtail Special Counsel Mueller's investigation in a manner exempting his own prior conduct, and tampered with at least 2 key witnesses. President Trump has instructed Mr. McGahn to defy a House committee subpoena for testimony, and his DOJ has erroneously argued that the courts can play no role in enforcing congressional subpoenas. 193. Special Counsel Mueller's investigation, like the House's impeachment inquiry, sought to uncover whether President Trump coordinated with a foreign government in order to obtain an improper advantage during a presidential election. And the Mueller investigation, like the House's impeachment inquiry, exposed President Trump's eagerness to benefit from foreign election interference. In the former instance, the president used his powers of office to undermine an investigation conducted by officials within the executive branch. In the latter, he attempted to block the United States of Representatives from exercising its sole powers of impeachment assigned by the Constitution. In both instances, President Trump obstructed investigations into foreign election interference to hide his own misconduct. Thank you, as read by Bradley Lawrence Bartz on January 19th, 2020, finishing at 11:29 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Impeach and remove President Donald J. Trump. Do your duty, all senators.